Hello, fellow Sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're lying beneath the stars, driving through silence, or just letting your mind cool at the end of a long day, this space is for you. Because tonight, we're journeying into the heart of a question almost too old to ask. How did early humans survive the desert, without walls, roofs, or shade? This is deep time storytelling and slow science for thoughtful minds. It's an untold story of endurance, one that began nearly 200,000 years ago under a sky of blistering heat and breathless wind. But this isn't about tents or shelters, not really. It's about how the human body itself and the human mind became the first form of architecture. Oh, and if you're the kind of strange and wonderful human who enjoys quiet, science-rich journeys like this, just look beneath the video. You'll see a button marked subscribe. Tap it if you like. You can leave any time. And if you'd like to be notified when new videos arrive, the bell icon is right beside it. Subscribing is how this channel stays alive. Without it, we can't keep making these. And, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, we'd love to hear in the comments. It reminds us we're not alone, and if you drift off, that's fine. Timestamps are waiting in the description. Now, we begin with skin beneath the sun. How do you survive a desert with nothing to shield you? No cloth, no tent, no wall, no carved rock to crouch beneath. Just the naked sun, beating down on skin and bone. Just open earth, blistering with heat. No civilization, no constructed world. Only the unfiltered face of nature. And us, walking straight into it. This is not a question about strength. It's a question about design. What does it mean that our earliest ancestors crossed into some of the hottest, driest places on Earth and stayed there? There is no more direct way to begin this story than to say plainly, early humans endured desert heat without shelter. For hundreds of generations, they walked, hunted, and survived in lands where shade was rare and mercy was rarer. Their bones did not melt, their minds did not break, their children did not vanish in the dust. They adapted, but more than that, they understood something about the desert that we, from our insulated lives of roofs and cool interiors, may have forgotten. And so the mystery stretches before us like the horizon itself. Not just how they endured, but what that endurance tells us about who we are. Beneath this question lies a landscape that seems, at first glance, to hold no welcome for life at all. In today's world, when we speak of deserts, especially those like the Sahara or the Rub al-Khali, we often imagine lifelessness, barren dunes, ski and sand locked in endless repetition. But that is the desert now. Long before the desert was sealed into its current dryness, it breathed with seasons, it pulsed with ancient monsoons, it opened its skin for short, strange moments of green. Tens of thousands of years ago, and sometimes hundreds of thousands, there were periods when the desert was not the desert, or rather, not the kind we imagine. Pleistocene climate cycles driven by shifts in Earth's orbit and axial tilt allowed for windows of possibility. These were the humid phases, intervals of several thousand years where rain returned, rivers ran again, and the impossible became real. The deserts of northern Africa and the Arabian Peninsula came alive with grasslands, lakes, and migrating animals. But these lush intervals were not permanent. They were breaths between droughts. And the people who followed the herds and foraged in these green pockets had to make decisions that would test the very edge of human ability. What happens when the rain stops, when the lake dries, when the trees vanish, and when every scrap of shade is erased? There are signs, faint, scattered, but persistent, that even after the green withdrew, some humans stayed behind. Not all retreated, not all fled. And so, in those shifting sands, we begin to find their echoes. Footprints in ancient lake beds, stone tools smoothed by wind, charcoal buried beneath layers of silt, each as a whisper in the wind, each as a clue, each as a reason to ask, what did they know that we don't? What does it take, in mind, in body and instinct, to look upon the horizon of heat and step forward? To answer this, we must stand where they stood. Not in the comfort of maps and satellite images, but in the raw immediacy of Paleolithic Africa and Arabia, where the air shimmered above cracked riverbeds, and the wind carried not relief, but dust. The regions we now call hyper-arid, the Sahara, the Danakil Depression, the Arabian Empty Quarter, were not always so. Yet even in their driest ages, life did not vanish entirely. It diminished, retreated into margins and pockets, but some humans remained and continued to walk their ancient paths. Geologists and paleoclimatologists speak of pluvial periods, intervals when monsoon systems shifted northward, bringing seasonal rains into what are today some of the hottest places on Earth. Lakes appeared where sand now rules. One of the most haunting examples lies in the Nefud Desert of Saudi Arabia, where an ancient lake bed named Al-Athar has preserved the footprints of humans and animals side by side, not carved in stone, not painted in ochre, but pressed into mud that dried, then waited. Elephants, camels, humans walking along the last edges of water. Their steps froze in time, as if the earth wished to remember them. Far to the west, in what is now the Sahara, there are similar ghosts. Fossilized shorelines ring the basins of extinct megalakes like Lake Megachad and Lake Fezzan. Stone tools cluster around their edges, Levallois flakes, hand axes, scrapers. The signature of Homo sapiens and perhaps also their cousins, archaic humans who moved through Africa before them. No walls stand here, no foundations of permanent homes, just tools, bones, and the shadows of campfires long smothered by sand. But tools alone cannot speak. They lie where they fell, silent, fragmented. They do not tell us if their makers rested in huts or slept under open stars. Yet the absence of evidence can sometimes whisper louder than a preserved structure. In these hyper-arid zones, wood decays, hide rots, fibres dissolve, but stone remains, and the stone is everywhere, without any sign of fixed settlement. No post holes, no trenches, no villages, only the rhythm of movement. What kind of a life leaves no walls? A life of adaptation, of minimal burdens, of profound knowledge. Imagine waking each morning in a land where the sunlight arrives not gently but like a blade, where the line between dawn and death might be only the timing of your first step. These humans did not build protection from the sun. They became protection. They carried it in their blood, in their behaviour, in their memory of the land. The desert is not generous, but it is honest. It gives nothing for free, but it reveals everything to those who listen. And so we must listen closely to what remains, a footprint hardened into stone, a scatter of flint beside a vanished stream, a trail of bones from an antelope brought down not in shade, but under an unforgiving sky. What must it have felt like to live in a world where your only shelter was your own endurance, where your survival depended not on what you built, but on what you understood? Among the things they understood was movement. The desert punishes permanence. It rewards those who know when to stay and when to leave. Fossilized evidence does not show great cities swallowed by sand, but instead the rhythmic pattern of presence and absence. A hearth here, then gone. A scatter of tools, then silence. The footprints found at Al-Athar are not random. They cluster, curve, and repeat, suggesting not a single passing but a path used again and again, a route, a habit, perhaps even a memory made solid by repetition. And if we trace these routes outward, we find similar signs scattered across thousands of kilometres, in the Dofa highlands of Oman, in the Egyptian Western Desert, in the Negev of the southern Levant. In each place, brief occupation, quick passing, but not disorganised, not desperate. What emerges is not the image of a people lost in a harsh world, but of a people who knew the world, who could read its smallest signs. Consider the value of a shadow, not the kind cast by a roof, but the fleeting one given by a solitary boulder, the west face of a dune, or the low branch of a hardy acacia tree. These were not luxuries. They were coordinates in the mind, places to pause, to cool the body just enough, to prepare for the next stretch. It was not about escaping the sun entirely. It was about dancing with it, knowing its arc, its moods, its threats. The sun, after all, is not only heat. It is direction. It is time. It is the daily heartbeat of the open world. These early desert dwellers must have watched the sun not just to fear it, but to learn from it. It told them when to rise, when to walk, when to rest. Their internal clocks were not calibrated by artificial light or the ticking of machines, but by the colour of the sky and the angle of warmth on their skin. And so the desert, which to us seems a place of deprivation, may have been for them a teacher. A strict one, yes. A severe one, but also a clear one. It taught them economy. It taught them to see. It stripped away the non-essential and left only what mattered. Movement, awareness, cooperation, timing. These were their architecture. Not walls, but patterns. Not ceilings, but rhythms. And in this stripped-down existence, perhaps there was also a kind of freedom. The liberation of carrying nothing, needing little, and being completely attuned to the world as it was, not as one might wish it to be. What would it feel like to be that alive, that exposed, that fluent in the desert's silence, and how did they know when it was time to move, or when the land itself was no longer survivable? The answer may lie in the smallest of traces, the way tools evolve from one layer to the next, the charcoal left from fires that shift in age and composition, the gradual abandonment of once favoured sites. Archaeology becomes a form of listening, and what it hears in the deserts of Africa and Arabia is not sudden disappearance, but slow withdrawal. The kind that happens when a people know the land is changing and begin to fold their stories inward, carrying them toward greener edges. But even as the green vanished, not all stories fled with it. Some remained, held in the bones of those who stayed. In the southern reaches of modern Egypt, near the Gilf Kebir Plateau, there are rock shelters where humans left behind hand stencils, animals drawn in pigment, and traces of ancient camps. These were not people clinging blindly to a dying place. These were people remembering it, mapping it, honouring what it had given. The artwork there does not show fear. It shows presence. It shows relation. It shows that the desert, at least for a time, was not just endured, but inhabited deeply. The mystery deepens when we look not just at where they stayed, but at how they prepared. In a world with no roofs, no walls, the body becomes both the burden and the solution. Homo sapiens, our direct ancestors, possessed adaptations that made them uniquely suited to the challenge. Long limbs, narrow bodies, sweating skin, a brain that could imagine the shape of the land beyond the horizon. These are not trivial details. They are the biological blueprints of survival. A wider nose may dissipate heat. A higher ratio of skin to mass allows more efficient cooling. The ability to sweat, a trait few mammals use as extensively as humans, allowed early desert walkers to lower their body temperature even in motion. But cooling by sweating is expensive. It costs water, so water too became a map. Every waterhole, every seasonal spring. Every carved depression in a rock that caught rain, all of these were landmarks more vital than any monument. They would have been passed down in memory, in root, in ritual, not written, not drawn, but spoken or shown, pointed to with the body, taught by walking. What stories carried those paths? How do you teach a child to survive where even a day's mistake can cost a life? This is the hidden architecture of the Paleolithic desert, a structure of knowing, not building, a memory, not a wall, a gesture toward the sun, not a roof beneath it. And when those memories failed, when the land dried too far, when the rains refused to return, they would not mourn the desert. They would move, just as their ancestors had moved before them, just as some would move again. But they left behind something sacred, a record without words. An endurance made visible by absence, and perhaps that is the most profound testament of all. Not what they left behind, but what they did not need to. The desert holds few skeletons. It does not preserve the fragile bodies of those who passed, but it preserves their choices, their paths, their decisions. Each flake of stone left beside a long-vanished spring, each fire pit filled with bones of gazelle or hare, each print in an ancient lake bed, fossilized in silence. These are not ruins, they are rhythms. The rhythm of a life that flowed with the land instead of fighting it. The rhythm of people who knew not only where the sun would be, but how their own bodies would respond to it. Who did not try to make the desert something else. Who did not conquer it, did not shield themselves from it, but learned to dwell inside its breath. This was not submission. This was symmetry. It is tempting, in our age of temperature-controlled existence, to see their way of life as fragile, primitive, barely survivable. But perhaps the opposite is true. Perhaps the fragility lies with us, with our dependency on structures, our fear of exposure, our disconnection from the rhythms that once sustained us. The Paleolithic wanderers of the Sahara and Arabia endured not because they had less, but because they required less. They did not need shade at all hours. They needed knowledge. They needed timing. They needed trust in each other, because no one survives the desert alone. The footprints at Alatha do not run. They do not scatter. They move together in parallel, children among them. Older steps matched with younger ones. They tell us this. The desert was crossed in company. In cooperation, in memory shared, in breath held and released together. These were not solitary ghosts. They were people, present and aware and alive in the full force of the sun's gaze. So when we ask how early humans endured the desert heat without shelter, we are really asking, how did they become the kind of beings who did not need to run from the heat? How did they become attuned, in skin and in soul, to a world that offered no mercy, and yet gave them everything, if only they learned how to see it? And maybe this is what remains for us. Not a lesson in survival, but a lesson in presence. The desert stripped them down to their essentials, not to destroy them, but to reveal them. What remains when nothing is left to hide behind? What strength is found in the open? The wind still moves over those ancient lake beds. The stones still lie scattered in the quiet. No voice cries out from the dust. And yet, we can hear them, if we listen, if we wonder, if we walk slowly enough to let the echoes speak. In the end, the greatest shelter may not be what we build, but what we become when we face the world as it is. And it was into this world, vast, breathless, shifting, that early humans began to move with increasing rhythm and reach, not away from difficulty, but into it. The call of the dunes was not a scream, not even a whisper, but a presence, an opening, a door that, for a brief time, stood ajar. Between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago, something changed in the bones of the world. The desert, usually so closed and unforgiving, began to pulse with a strange possibility. Rain fell, lakes rose, and what had once been oceanic in its barrenness became dotted with green veins, corridors of life threading through silence. This was not a transformation in the human body, but in the Earth's orbit. Cycles of eccentricity and obliquity tilted the planet just enough, just long enough, to draw the monsoons northward. The Sahara, now the largest hot desert in the world, greened. So did much of the Arabian Peninsula, its sand softened by ephemeral grasslands, its gravel plains broken by rivers that briefly flowed. These were the green Sahara periods, and they were rare, like low tides in a sea of desolation. But when they came, they rewrote the map. To the early humans living in sub-Saharan Africa, these green corridors were not mere luxuries, they were invitations, pathways north, out of familiar woodlands and into the unfamiliar openness of desert margins, and beyond those, into continents unimagined. The first great expansions of our species, and perhaps of our predecessors too, began not with bold leaps, but with cautious footsteps along new rivers, across new grass. Why did they go? Why leave the known for the unknown, the shaded for the searing, the familiar call of savanna birds for the distant silence of stony plateaus? Perhaps it was hunger. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was memory, inherited through stories or migrations already begun long before. But whatever the cause, they walked, and the earth met them halfway. It is difficult from within our static cities and border-bound nations to understand just how fluid the world was then. Climates shifted over generations, lakes appeared, then vanished. Animal herds wandered freely between regions we now call countries. For early humans, the horizon was not a limit, but a question. What lies beyond the next ridge? And sometimes, beyond that ridge, there was water. And water changes everything. A single spring in a dry basin could mean days of life. A seasonal river, even one that only flowed once each year, could trace a path that no compass could find. And when those waters returned, humans followed them, not in haste but in rhythm, marking time with the land's own breathing. How do you map a world that changes every few lifetimes? How do you follow rivers that remember rains long past? What does it mean to walk into a desert? Not to escape the world, but to find a way through it. To begin answering this, we must kneel beside the traces they left behind, traces so faint that for decades we mistook their silence for absence. But deserts are keepers of memory, and the wind does not erase everything. In the Arabian Peninsula, scattered across regions like the Nefud Desert and the Dofa Highlands, researchers have unearthed tools left by those first desert crossers, carefully crafted flakes, blades, and cores, shaped by hands that knew both stone and survival. At Jebel Fire, in the United Arab Emirates, layers of tools tell a story of presence that goes back more than 125,000 years. This site lies not on a coast, not near a forest, but within what is now a barren plain. Yet in those days the land was different. There were lakes, there were animals, and perhaps most importantly, there were people willing to follow them. The tools at Fire suggest a continuity of knowledge, a lineage of technique that points not to accidental wanderers, but to deliberate movement, even planning. Further inland, the now arid Nefud Desert reveals another chapter. At sites like Al-Wusta, the fossil of a single human finger, over 85,000 years old, was found near the shores of what was once a freshwater lake. Beside it, footprints of elephants, horses, and other megafauna. This was not a lonely outpost. It was a crossroads, a place where the lives of animals and humans briefly aligned beneath the memory of rain. What did that lake look like? What kind of sky stretched above it? Did children laugh at its edges? Did firelight reflect in its waters? The story continues in Africa as well. At sites like Unyanga in Chad and Bir Sahara in Egypt, tool scatters and ancient lake sediments paint a picture of mobility and resourcefulness. These were not lush, Edenic landscapes, but neither were they empty. They were dynamic, shifting spaces, and humans learned to ride their rhythms. It was not just geography that dictated where people went. It was timing, knowing when to move, when to wait, when to test a new route. Migration in these green desert periods was not a flood, but a pulse, a beating of feet in sync with the seasons, and with each pulse, knowledge travelled, of where the waterholes lay, of where animals crossed, of which plants could be eaten, and which stones could be struck into edge. The desert became a memory palace, and those who crossed it were not reckless. They were brilliant navigators of change. What kind of mind watches the rain return and thinks it is time to go? What kind of courage does it take to follow a greening wind into the unknown? Is it still migration, if the land itself is inviting you forward? To accept that invitation, early humans did not require maps. They required eyes, ears, memory shaped by long observation. The dunes themselves are not always hostile, but they are deceptive. They change their shape from season to season, shift their colour with the angle of light. Yet beneath their motion lies permanence, low ridges of stone, familiar trees, dry riverbeds that crack the surface like ancient veins. These were the landmarks that mattered. In the minds of those who crossed these margins, the world was not divided into wilderness and home. It was all home, or all potential home, if read correctly. And reading the land was not metaphorical. It was literal. The print of a hoof in wet soil, the faint scent of water carried by wind, the birds that circled a valley, all were signals, a language of survival spoken through texture and pattern. To those who listened well, even the silence had meaning, and where water appeared, so too did game. The temporary greening of desert corridors brought with it antelope, gazelle, elephant, and rhinoceros. Early humans would have followed these herds, not as predators lurking behind, but as partners in motion. The animals knew where water would return before it did, and by watching them, tracking their paths, their rhythms, humans became part of a wider web of intelligence. This was not domination. It was alignment. What does it mean to be guided not by stars or stones, but by the wisdom of hooves? The lure of the desert was never in its safety. It was in its potential, a chance to move beyond the edge of what was known, to expand the reach of memory, one valley at a time. And for a species like ours, curious, restless, uniquely adapted to long-distance travel, That call was irresistible. We must not imagine these journeys as epic odysseys undertaken in desperation. They were gradual, generational, a slow diffusion through time, like the spreading of fire along a dry field. Families moved, returned, split off, stayed behind, and with every step, knowledge was recalibrated. A new waterhole remembered, a shortcut forgotten, a crossing point over rocks marked by a cairn or a painted stone. These were not paths marked on maps, but routes encoded into the body, into the bones even. Because the bones remember. Fossils tell us not just when humans arrived, but how long they stayed. The pattern of wear on teeth, the isotopes embedded in collagen, all whisper of what was eaten, how far one walked, what kind of climate the body endured. And when those bodies lie beside tools and animal bones, a fuller story begins to emerge. Not of a single journey, but of a network of lives, woven into the breath of a land that was always changing. What kind of species becomes stronger when everything else disappears? One shaped not by excess, but by scarcity. One refined not in places of plenty, but in the margins, where breath is a decision and time a razor. In the dry borderlands of the Paleolithic world, early humans were not buffered by the stability we now take for granted. They lived by reading signals, adjusting not just day to day, but hour by hour, tracing the subtle rhythms of a landscape that could shift from generosity to cruelty in a single season. And it is here, in this constant negotiation, that something astonishing happened. Our species didn't just survive the harshness, it thrived in it. On the Arabian Peninsula, across what is now a parched vastness, stone tool traditions discovered at sites like Jubba and Shuwaimis tell a quiet but compelling story. They appear not as scattered outposts of desperation, but as expressions of continuity, of belonging. Hand axes shaped with care, points retouched and reused, scrapers worn smooth with labour. These were not random wanderers, these were craftspeople tuned to the tempo of scarcity. Beside the tools, sometimes barely discernible beneath millennia of windborne dust, lie the remains of hearths, simple rings of scorched earth, or the faint outline of fire-blackened stone. These hearths are punctuation marks in a language we are only just learning to read. They are pauses in long journeys, moments of stillness, places where warmth met memory, and memory met voice. Around them we imagine the trading of food, the whisper of instruction, the anchoring presence of light in the darkness. But not all knowledge was shared through words. Much of it moved in the body, in gait, in gesture, in the angle of a glance across open land. How do you carry a map when your hands are full? You carry it in your stride, you carry it in your silence. These people learned to move lightly, not because they lacked materials, but because the land itself taught them that heaviness is risk. To carry too much is to sink. To build too long is to be left behind. So they made knowledge their shelter and let the desert pass over them like wind. In this way, even temporary water sources became embedded into tradition, folded into the seasonal behaviour of people who were never quite still, yet never quite lost. And in these windows of greening, when rainfall briefly brushed life into valleys and hard pan, when animals returned and plants broke the surface with sudden urgency, the desert itself seemed to breathe. It allowed passage, not always, not often, but enough, just enough. What is a doorway that only opens every 20,000 years? And what kind of mind watches for its opening, then steps through? Perhaps it is the same mind that first imagined a future beyond the horizon. Not just a destination, but a world rearranged. A future made not of more, but of better timing. For those who followed the pulse of water through the changing Sahara, across the spine of Arabia, and into the waiting lands beyond, the decision to move was never arbitrary. It was a response to the soil, to the sky, to the whispers of wind passing over stone, and it was in these responses that the architecture of migration was laid. Imagine the desert not as obstacle, but as an ancient lung, exhaling rain, inhaling dust, each breath a cycle of life and retreat. Now imagine people who knew how to move with that breath. These early humans did not cross empty wastelands by accident. They traced subtle lines invisible to those who did not know how to look. Lines of remembered lakes, of extinct rivers, of long-forgotten game trails. These paths had no names, but they had memory, passed through generations, etched into behaviour like gravity beneath the skin. And sometimes those paths converged, at oases where palms now struggle to grow, at depressions where ancient aquifers once surfaced, at lake beds so wide that the edges disappeared into the shimmer. In these places gatherings happened, tools were exchanged, food was shared, languages, perhaps still forming, braided into gestures. These were the human centres of the Paleolithic world, not permanent cities, but temporal constellations of life. Moments of convergence before dispersing again, like stars breaking apart before dawn. Archaeological evidence supports this vision. Sites like the Jubba, Paleo Lakes, Al Wusta, and Bir Tafawi all show repeated human visitation across thousands of years, always during wetter intervals. The layers are thin, the objects are few. But they align with climatic records, the greening of corridors, the flow of rivers, the return of rain. What emerges is not a picture of aimless wandering, but of exquisite adaptation to an unstable world. The desert's silence was not a warning. It was a filter. Only those who could listen belonged. And when the rains finally faded, when the monsoons pulled southward and the sands crept forward again, these same humans moved once more. Some returned to safer regions, some followed coastal routes, some found new havens further north or deeper into the interior, but wherever they went they took the desert with them. Not the sand, the wisdom, the patience, the pulse of risk and timing. That, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of the Green Sahara, not the trails it opened, but the way of seeing it required. A way of reading the land like a living story, a way of waiting without fear, moving without panic, trusting not permanence, but change. And so the call of the dunes was never a call to settle. It was a call to listen, to learn, to let the earth lead, and to walk, when the time was right, into the silence, not as a stranger but as something shaped by it. So the call of the dunes was never a call to settle. It was a call to listen, to learn, to let the earth lead, and to walk, when the time was right, into the silence. Not as a stranger, but as something shaped by it. But to be shaped by the desert is not only a matter of mind or memory. It is a matter of skin, of sweat, of blood moving beneath the surface. It is the body itself, sculpted over countless generations, that answers the sun. Before tools. Before language, before fire, there was flesh. And in that flesh, an ancient design, a heat-adapted survivor born not of comfort, but of constraint. The human body is not armoured. It does not have claws, nor thick fur, nor the cooling ears of the desert hare. And yet, in the hottest corners of the earth, it walked upright, exposed and unbroken. What allowed this strange creature, naked, bipedal, slow to mature, to outlast predators, outpace prey, and endure the oven breath of the midday sun? The answer begins at the surface. Human skin, bare and rich with sweat glands, is a paradox. We are the most hairless of all primates, yet among the most equipped to cool ourselves on the move. Each square inch of skin is a theatre of evaporation, and sweat, though costly, is a silent technology. It allows the body to regulate its core without retreat. Unlike panting, which requires pause and exposes vulnerability, sweating allows a human to keep going, walking, tracking, hunting, even in full sunlight. But it is not just sweat that saves us. It is the shape that carries it. The tall, narrow frame of many ancestral populations, long limbs, lean torsos, wide noses, is not accidental. It is architecture, a design written by millennia of exposure. A tall body sheds heat more efficiently than a compact one. Long limbs increase surface area. Narrow builds let warmth dissipate. Even the nose, that protrusion of cartilage and bone, adapts to air's dryness, humidifying and cooling as it passes. And deep within, the body's internal thermostat, the hypothalamus, pulses in time with the sun's arc, sending blood to the skin's surface, adjusting breath, modulating effort. It is not flawless, but it is tuned to movement through heat. This was not evolution in lush forests or cold steppes. This was evolution under open skies, where there was nowhere to hide and no luxury in standing still. So the desert was not only a test, it was a forge, and the body that emerged from it was not merely surviving, it was meant for this. How many other creatures can run in heat, without shade for hours? How many can sweat so profusely and yet live? What does it mean that endurance was our first true invention, and that our own skin was the earliest shelter we ever knew? The idea seems fragile, almost naive, that a creature so exposed, so physically vulnerable, could walk into lands where even the wind seemed to burn. But it is this very vulnerability that became our strength. Where other mammals needed protection from heat, we were shaped to meet it head-on, not with resistance, but with remarkable efficiency, and no adaptation captures this better than our ability to walk, upright, balanced, and enduring. The shift to bipedalism is among the most defining features of our lineage. It arrived not all at once, but gradually over millions of years, a slow rearrangement of pelvis, spine, and foot. And while the reasons for this transformation remain layered in debate, one benefit becomes strikingly clear in the context of open, arid environments. Walking on two legs minimizes heat exposure. A quadruped's back, parallel to the earth, receives the full assault of overhead sunlight. But an upright walker exposes less surface area to the sun's zenith, just the crown of the head and the shoulders, while the rest of the body benefits from vertical airflow. And airflow in the desert is everything. The human body rising vertically from the ground is essentially a chimney, allowing heated air to move upward, drawing cooler air across the limbs, lifting sweat into evaporation. With every stride, the body fans itself, and the longer the stride, the more complete the cooling. This is not a coincidence. It is engineering, not of machines, but of muscle and bone, refined not in workshops, but across hundreds of thousands of years of walking toward water. Yet walking upright is not just a physical act. It frees the hands, it opens the chest, it elevates the eyes, and in this elevation, something more begins to stir, a new relationship with the horizon. To walk on two legs is to see further, to plan routes, to track distant animals, to spot shelter in the shimmer of heat. It is to predict, to imagine, and this too is survival. Other creatures in the desert crouch, burrow, or flee, but early humans endured by standing tall, not because it was safe, but because it allowed them to see further than danger. In a land where resources were scattered, and threat came often with silence, this height was not a luxury. It was a lifeline, and the endurance didn't stop with the legs. The shape of the human foot, with its arch and heel, absorbs shock over long distances. The Achilles tendon stores and releases energy with every step. Our lungs, unusually large for our body size, pull in vast quantities of air to fuel motion over hours, not just bursts. Every joint, every ligament is tuned to the slow persistence of walking. So what kind of creature did the desert shape? Not a sprinter, not a hider, but a walker, a strider. A being made not for escape but for arrival, over and over again across distances no other predator would dare. And it is here, when we begin to compare, that the true strangeness of the human form becomes clear. Because in the kingdom of mammals, endurance in heat is a rarity. Few animals can tolerate prolonged motion under the sun. Fewer still can do so without collapsing from thermal overload. The desert lion hunts at night. The cheetah, master of the sprint, burns its energy in seconds and then must rest. Even camels, icons of arid endurance, cool themselves not through sweat, but through a complex set of heat storage and passive loss, resting during the day and moving mostly in the cooler hours. But the human runs in daylight. There are records, both modern and ancient, of people tracking animals for hours, even days, across open savanna and into desert scrub, not with speed, but with consistency. This is known as persistence hunting, a slow, steady pursuit that relies not on strength, nor surprise, but on outlasting. Under the hammer of the sun, as the animal overheats and must stop to rest, the human keeps going, drinking little, carrying nothing, following tracks, droppings, patterns in the dust, until finally the prey collapses, not from wounds, but from exhaustion. No lion hunts this way, no wolf, no bear, only us. And it's not only about movement, it's about what movement allows. When a creature can stay upright in the sun, when it can keep its brain cool while the air boils around it, it unlocks something most animals never get: choice. Most desert dwellers live at the mercy of their environment. They hide in burrows, they sleep through heat, they wait. But the human body, with its millions of eccrine sweat glands, with its bipedal poise and stride, is a system that acts, that chooses direction, that pursues. But endurance does not only belong to the body, it must be taught to the mind. And early humans must have learned, even before language fully bloomed, that their power lay not in confrontation, but in refusal to quit. They could not leap. They could not climb quickly. They could not kill with claws or teeth, but they could move and keep moving until even the fiercest creature stopped. This is not dominance, it is devotion. It is the quiet decision to continue again and again, despite heat, despite distance, despite fear. In evolutionary terms, it is genius. And so, as the green windows of desert life opened and closed, as rains came and went, and the landscape shifted from savanna to scrub to stone, it was not the strongest who remained, nor the fastest. It was the ones who had learned to turn their own biology into a tool, who had made of their bodies something more than shelter. Something like a question asked against the sun. How far can you go when nothing but your flesh and your fire remains? Farther than almost any other creature. Not because we are the strongest, but because we are the most stubborn. And beneath that stubbornness lies something extraordinary. A built-in cooling system coupled with a brain that must stay safe at all costs. While many mammals overheat under sustained exertion, humans evolved a way to protect the most fragile part of us, our minds. Even when the rest of the body begins to strain, the secret lies in blood and breath. As the body heats, blood rises to the skin, carrying warmth away from the core. Sweat glands release moisture, and the breeze, even a faint one, pulls the heat off through evaporation. But deeper still, a network of vessels directs cool blood toward the brain. In some populations, particularly those from historically hot regions, sinuses and arteries work in tandem to reduce the temperature of the blood as it approaches the skull. It is as though evolution decided, you may burn, but your thoughts must not. Most mammals pant to cool themselves, a process that works only while still or moving slowly. Try to run while panting and the system fails. Humans, by contrast, can maintain stable brain temperatures while moving across vast distances, because we separated breathing from cooling. We do not need to open our mouths in desperation. We use our skin as our cooling surface, the largest organ we have. In this, we are more like a river than a wall. We do not resist heat. We allow it to move through us, then release it. And while our bodies manage this balance, our posture contributes in quiet, critical ways. Upright walking reduces the amount of direct solar radiation absorbed by the torso. The head, with its thick hair acting as a natural insulator, receives the harshest light, while the shoulders, chest, and back remain relatively shaded due to their vertical angle. Standing tall also exposes more surface area to wind. Heat rises off us like steam from a clay pot. Compare this to the antelope, which must pause to pant. To the lion, which must seek shade after a short chase. To the hyena, whose thick fur traps warmth. To the wolf, built for cold pursuits, not blistering plains. Even the camel, master of sand and thirst, cannot run for hours without overheating. Its gift is endurance in stillness, the ability to wait out the sun. Ours is endurance in movement, the ability to walk within it. And that is perhaps the most beautiful truth hidden in this adaptation. We were not designed to conquer the desert. We were designed to travel through it, flesh harmonizing with heat, breath matching the rhythm of horizon after horizon. Our ancestors did not endure the sun by hiding from it. They stepped beneath it, learned its tempo, and shaped themselves around its fire. And in that shaping, something more than survival was born. There was a transformation, not just of biology, but of behavior, a recalibration of what the human being could be when stripped of shelter, when faced with the raw equation of heat, distance, and time. Because what the desert demanded was not just a body that could endure, but a mind that could wait, a will that could sustain, a spirit not just of resistance, but of resilience. The fire within, that metaphor so often evoked, was, in the desert, not just poetic, it was literal. The body, like the earth, became a furnace. Muscles burned glucose, skin flushed with blood, the core radiated heat, and through it all, the human endured, not by extinguishing the fire, but by learning to breathe with it, to move in concert with it, to let it pass through them without consuming. And it is no coincidence that, at the same time these bodies evolved to navigate heat, our ancestors were learning to control a fire of their own, not just the one inside, but the one built by hand, the flame, the hearth, the nightlight in the wilderness. Fire became the companion of flesh, echoing its warmth, mirroring its rhythms. When the sun fell and the chill crept in, it was fire that extended the day, fire that made desert nights livable, fire that told stories, even before language had a name for itself. In this sense, flesh and fire were never separate. One was the internal flame, metabolizing, radiating, enduring. The other was the external, protecting, gathering, illuminating. And both required fuel. Both demanded knowledge. Just as the body needed water and salt to keep its cooling system alive, the fire needed dry wood, good timing, patience. A spark alone was never enough. So the desert became a classroom, a place where the twin technologies of biology and behaviour were tested under the most unforgiving conditions. Those who failed, vanished. Those who succeeded passed on something wordless and vital, how to be a moving flame in a world of sand. And this may be the deepest mystery of all, that the earliest humans who braved the desert did not do so with houses or armour, but with skin and stride. They did not wait for the world to soften. They softened themselves to the world. And their legacy, invisible but unbroken, lives in us still, in every drop of sweat, in every long walk beneath the sun, in every breath that cools a racing heart. So when we look at the desert now and ask how they endured without shelter, the answer is not in tents or tools. It is in the shape of our limbs, the tilt of our pelvis, the salt in our sweat, the fire in our chest. They did not build shade. They became it. To walk the desert was to read a language older than words. Because in this world of fire and stillness, where shade was fleeting and wind left no footprints, survival depended not on the structures you built, but on the ground beneath your feet. Not on resisting the land, but listening to it. And what was this skin of the earth, if not a living map? To the untrained eye, it appears empty, endless sand, scattered rock, and an indifferent sun. But to those who knew how to look, every grain whispered. Shadows slid across the faces of rocks like sundials marking the hours. Dunes shifted in rhythmic waves, revealing where the wind had last blown. A splash of lichen on the shaded side of a boulder, a sudden swell of green where groundwater still lingered from last season's rain. These were not just observations, they were invitations. Because the first shelter was not something you carried, it was something you recognized. Early humans learned to use the land itself as a shifting living form of refuge. A single stone slab, angled just right, could cast a morning shadow long enough to rest within. A concave depression in a canyon wall, facing away from the sun's descent, might hold cool air through midday. A cluster of dunes, blown into crescent shapes, revealed which sides would stay in shade as the sun climbed. To walk through this land was to understand how it moved, not just across seasons, but hour by hour. And when the sun reached its cruelest zenith, they did not fight it. They waited. Somewhere within a crack of limestone, beneath an overhang carved by wind over millennia, they sat. Bodies pressed low to the ground, backs against the cool stone, eyes half shut, listening. Because the desert was not to be conquered. It was to be timed. To move too soon, or too late, was to waste precious water and strength. To travel without reading the land was to vanish into it. But how did they know where to stop? How did they find these spaces of relief hidden in a landscape that offered so little margin for error? Because the desert, when it allows you to survive, rarely shouts. It whispers, a change in the echo of a footfall. a scent in the air that wasn't there an hour before, a line of cracked clay that had dried more slowly than the rest, meaning it had once held water. There are stories, passed down by desert peoples even today, of elders teaching the young how to read the shadow of one stone across another, how to hear the difference between silence and stillness, and you, the listener, the distant descendant, carry fragments of this knowledge still, buried in your perception. Have you ever noticed how instinct draws you toward a tree's shadow in summer? How your pace slows in open sun without needing to think? These are echoes, carried in the blood, because long before we built roofs we found shade. We found it in the curve of stone, in the belly of earth, in the silence between footsteps. And just as the land offered moments of mercy, it also offered signs, quiet traces left by animals, water and wind. To move through the Paleolithic desert was to be a tracker, even if you did not call yourself one. The ability to follow life by reading the language of the ground was not a skill reserved for hunters. It was part of everyday existence, woven into the rhythm of waking, walking and waiting. Imagine standing before a stretch of cracked earth, seemingly featureless. To many, it might say nothing. But to the trained eye, there are stories written in dust. A line of tiny, crescent-shaped prints might belong to a gazelle, its hooves sharp and close together. Drag marks across a shallow dune could indicate a snake or lizard, active during the cool dawn hours. And then there are the deeper, smoother indentations, the spoor of heavier mammals perhaps moving toward water. Each mark has a direction, each spacing a speed, each overlap a timeline. And humans too left their signatures, footprints preserved in damp sand or silt, sometimes fossilized by luck and time. Some of the oldest footprints ever discovered lie in these once green desert corridors, in places like the Nephid Desert in Saudi Arabia, or the muddy plains near Lake Natron. There, side by side with elephant tracks and gazelle trails, are the prints of people, narrow heels, toes splayed slightly, a rhythm that says, "We walked here. We paused. We chose a path." But they did not walk blindly. They followed the signs. Dry rivulets indicated past rains. Cracked mud told you where water once lingered. Clusters of dung, still warm, revealed a herd's recent presence, and in the desert, where animals go, water often follows. Even the insects played a role. A sudden burst of dragonflies too far from a known oasis might hint at hidden moisture beneath a patch of reeds. And then there is the wind. It erases much, but never entirely. It smooths over clues, yet leaves patterns of its own. Wind-scoured surfaces reveal older trails etched deep enough to resist time. The direction of blown sand can shift daily, but humans learned to watch not just the sand, but how it moved around objects. A rock with a long trail of silt behind it meant steady breezes from one direction. In this, they could predict shelter. They could guess where dunes would cast shade hours later. And when the clues were few, they turned to instinct. The angle of slopes, the warmth of soil underfoot, the colour of scattered leaves. It was a kind of environmental literacy, developed not in schools but through repetition, error and survival. This relationship with the ground, with the earth's skin, was intimate, not separate from the self, but part of it. Every journey was a reading, every pause a translation. To survive, you had to listen with your feet and see with more than your eyes. And if you listened closely enough, the ground would tell you when to move and when not to. Because in the desert, time is not a clock. It is a temperature. It is a shade's length. It is the pulse of heat rising from stone and sand. And here, one of the oldest truths our ancestors learned was this: do not move when the earth is burning. Beneath a mid-afternoon sun, ground temperatures can reach levels far beyond the air above, hot enough to blister skin, to cook meat, to draw the last moisture from your breath. A rock that seemed like shelter in the morning becomes an oven by noon. The sand, soft and golden at sunrise, hardens into searing grit. No animal walks during this time unless it must. And humans, though they could endure more than most, knew better than to challenge the midday. So instead, they moved with the bookends of light. Crepuscular movement, travel at dawn and dusk, became the rhythm of survival. These margins of day were cooler, quieter, and rich with opportunity. Predators were few, the air still. The ground, having released some of its heat overnight, offered a gentler surface, and the colours, those deep amber skies and violet shadows, signalled a time of possibility. Even today, desert pastoralists and nomads plan their travel this way. Long before the world's clocks and compasses, there were other instruments. The taste of the air, the way your shadow leaned, the dampness in your breath. These were the signals that it was time to move. But this wasn't just about avoiding heat. It was about coordination with the landscape's own breath. The desert is not static. It expands and contracts with temperature. Winds shift. Animals appear and vanish. Water evaporates or pools unexpectedly. By moving at the edges of the day, early humans tuned themselves to these fluctuations. They did not control the desert. They moved with its lungs. And because of this timing, paths became patterns. Trail systems emerged not as rigid roads, but as seasonal suggestions. You could follow an animal track until it vanished, then wait. Observe, let the land speak again. One wrong hour could mean missing a waterhole's shadow. One premature footstep might send a hidden herd scattering into unknowable silence. So, movement was thoughtful. Each step a decision. You walked not just toward something, but with something. The ground beneath you, the light above you, the rhythm between. It is tempting to think of early humans as lost wanderers in a harsh place, but the truth is far more elegant. They were readers of heat and silence, carriers of patience, movers between margins. They watched the ground not as an obstacle, but as a living script. And it was through this conversation, this deep-time dialogue with terrain, that survival became not just possible, but beautiful. Because to follow the land, to truly know it, was to accept that the earth had moods. Its skin shifted from moment to moment, shaped by sun and shadow, memory and movement. It was not something to be walked upon lightly. It was something to be read, gently, with reverence and precision. And so the early human became both traveller and translator. Some of the oldest known desert routes in Africa and Arabia reveal this balance between precision and intuition. The scatter of stone tools at Jebel Faya in the United Arab Emirates suggests that humans occupied this region over 100,000 years ago, not by accident, but because they understood when the desert softened. During brief windows when monsoon swept northward, the desert margins greened. Lakes appeared, rivers returned, game flourished. But these were fleeting chapters in an otherwise unforgiving book. What's astonishing is not that people arrived during these rare interludes, but that they knew how to wait for them. How to recognize when the Earth's surface changed ever so slightly, soil becoming dark with moisture, vegetation creeping into dry basins, certain birds returning to ancient nesting sites. These were signals not just of survival, but of possibility, of when to move and where. And when the rains receded and the green faded, they did not despair. They shifted. They retreated to rocky outcrops, to higher ground, to shaded wadis where the last pockets of life clung on. The relationship was never static. It was adaptive, a kind of ritual dance between human and habitat. You observed, you waited, you acted. In many cases, this meant using the smallest variations in terrain for refuge. The shadow side of a boulder might hold 4 degrees of difference, enough to make a resting spot tolerable. A patch of gravel, coarser than the surrounding sand, might retain less heat and offer firmer footing. A long-fallen tree, stripped of bark and bleached by decades, could become a midday marker. Shade at 10, then again at 2. There are records from modern Bedouin traditions that speak of how to sleep with the earth. You do not lie just anywhere. You test the soil with your palm. You feel its heat, not just on the surface, but how deep it travels. You angle your body with the wind, using it to wick away warmth without exposing your face. You curl into contours that mimic animal dens, not because it is instinctive, but because it is learned. And it was learned over thousands of years, passed through bodies before it ever reached language, through gestures, through pauses, through where a foot was placed and where it wasn't. Because the skin of the earth holds stories, but only for those slow enough to hear them. And in this silence, this great patience, something else began to take root. Not just survival, but something like trust. The kind of trust that can only come from attention, from returning again and again to the same places, not to claim them, but to greet them. To recognize the hollow in the canyon wall not as shelter, but as companion. To know that a patch of soil, pale and cracked in just the right way, meant water once ran there, and might again. This intimacy with land did not come from dominating it. It came from being humbled by it. You could not cross the desert by force, you had to be taught. And the teaching was slow, unforgiving, beautiful. Over time, this created something more than adaptation. It created memory, not just within the body, but within the land itself. Trails formed not from single journeys, but from generations of feet brushing the same lines into the dust. Waterholes became known not by maps, but by stories. Landmarks were not named, but described. The stone shaped like a sleeping goat. The wind-cut path that whistles at night. These were coordinates of a different kind. Not geometric, but poetic. Not abstract, but lived. And these maps, etched into minds and footsteps, so were flexible, not fixed, because the land changed. A dune could disappear in a season. A rock could crack, fall, and turn a path into a dead end. So you listened. Again and again, you listened. The desert did not reward memory alone. It rewarded attentiveness. Even today, some of the most skilled trackers in the world, the San of the Kalahari, the Bedouin of the Empty Quarter, speak of the ground with reverence. Not because it is sacred in a mystical sense, but because it is instructive. It tells you where life has passed and where it might still pass. It tells you, if you know how to ask, when to rest, when to run, when to wait. And though we live now behind walls, beneath roofs, travelling in machines that mute the ground's voice beneath wheels and pavement, that instinct, that ancient literacy, still flickers beneath the surface of who we are. Have you ever walked barefoot across sand and paused, unconsciously, at the place where it cools? Have you ever looked to the horizon at sunset and felt something shift inside? A readiness to move, or to stop? These are whispers from your oldest teacher. The land, the ground, the skin of the earth. And so the story of survival in the desert was never about escaping it. It was about learning to move as part of it, not above it, not apart from it, but with it. Because long before there were shelters, there was knowledge, and the ground remembers those who listened. They were not toys, not weapons, not even mere tools. They were memory. They were foresight carved into flint. And in the desert, where the horizon offers little mercy and less warning, the human hand found in stone a way to outthink time itself. What must it have felt like to pick up a rock and imagine something inside it that didn't yet exist? In the shimmering desolation of Paleolithic Africa and Arabia, the sun punished the unprepared, and the land gave little in return without precision. The early humans who moved across this terrain were not just surviving, they were planning, adapting, sculpting thought into matter. Stone tools, chipped and shaped with care, were not just instruments of utility, they were expressions of cognition, portable strategies, carried across vast expanses of emptiness, designed to serve not only the needs of the moment but the threats of tomorrow. What marked this desert toolkit as extraordinary was not just its durability, but its elegance. Each flake struck from a core was the product of an intimate negotiation between mind and material. The angle, the force, the fracture, all had to be anticipated. This was not brute labour, it was choreography. The ache of trial and error had, over generations, become something close to grace. Archaeologists have found these tools scattered like fossilised thoughts across the ancient gravel plains of the Nafud, the highlands of Ethiopia, the dry lake beds of Kenya. Some are simple scrapers or points, others more sophisticated blades with refined symmetry. But what unites them is not their form, it is their logic. Each one carries the whisper of a brain that could think beyond the immediate, a brain that understood. This shard will matter tomorrow. Why does that matter? Because in a desert, contingency is everything. Food does not come when called. Water does not announce its presence. To move through this landscape without a plan was to vanish into it. And so these early toolmakers crafted kits, small assemblages of shaped stones that could be reused, reworked and repurposed, tools that could be carried for weeks, then quickly brought to life in moments of urgency. They were light enough to travel with, strong enough to matter, sharp enough to change outcomes. And heat, constant, merciless heat, shaped every choice. Materials had to withstand not just use, but exposure. Basalt, chert, quartzite, these were not chosen at random. They were selected because they could endure the cycles of sun and shade, of expansion and contraction. A tool left in the wrong spot could crack or warp by the next morning. A toolkit was not just a set of objects, it was a language of resilience, and its grammar was thermodynamic. So every blade was a hypothesis, every core a journal of possibilities. What kind of mind prepares for a danger it cannot yet see in a place that offers no second chances? The kind of mind that is always watching the horizon, even when there is nothing on it. The kind that walks with memory in one hand and possibility in the other. These stone tools were not made in moments of crisis. They were made before the need arose, in the lull between movement and stillness, in the hush before hunger. They were made for the future. This is what separates a tool from a response. The early humans of the Paleolithic desert were not simply reacting to their environment. They were anticipating it. Their flint was foresight. Their cores were calendars. In a terrain where nothing could be counted on except the return of the sun, they created instruments of control, not over nature, but over their relationship with it. And in this relationship, mobility was everything. The desert does not permit hoarding. It discourages weight. It punishes the unnecessary. So the tools carried had to be efficient, light, multifunctional, capable of being adapted to any moment. A single hand axe might be used for digging roots, cutting meat, shaping wood, or even as a projectile. This wasn't improvisation. It was design. Minimalism not as a philosophy but as a law of survival. Even more, these tools weren't just made at the site of need. Many were made in advance and carried long distances. Archaeological studies from sites like Jubba and Jebel Fire have revealed stone tools fashioned from materials not found locally, implying either trade, transport, or memory. Someone had to recall where the good stone was. Someone had to travel there, chip it, shape it, and carry it forward across weeks or seasons. And then, at some distant camp, under a setting sun, those same tools would be used to skin an animal, crack a marrow-rich bone, or scrape a hide for shelter. In this sense, the toolkit was not just a collection of items. It was a cognitive map, a record of landscapes previously walked, and an investment in those yet to be reached. And they didn't always use what was easy. Sometimes they brought with them stones that were harder to shape but would last longer in the sun. Sometimes they sacrificed the convenience of quick flakes for the reliability of a stronger edge. That kind of decision, delayed gratification, strategic material selection, is not instinct. It is intelligence. It is experience made solid. It is also trust. Trust that tomorrow will come, that the tool will be needed, that the body carrying it will still be moving, still alive, still searching. Because in a world where everything else erodes, a blade chipped from flint can endure. And in its edges, in its curves, you find the fingerprints of minds that live not in panic, but in preparation. But the purpose of these tools was not only immediate need, it was memory, repeated. Each tool was a fragment of accumulated experience, a piece of knowledge pressed into stone so it wouldn't vanish when the person holding it did. In a landscape where wind erased footprints and sun-bleached bone, stone endured, it became a vessel for what the mind could not carry alone. Consider the process. Before a tool could even exist, there had to be a quarry, a place where raw stone was found, tested, chosen. Hands ran over the cool surface of flint nodules buried in chalky hills. Ears listened for the right sound, a clean, ringing tone when struck lightly, indicating a fine-grained structure within. The first blow was not random, it was a question. Will you break as I need you to? If the stone answered correctly, the shaping began. This was not an isolated act. Tool-making was taught. Not through language at first, but through demonstration. A master knapper's movements would be copied, mimicked, committed to muscle. Hands would learn what words could not yet describe. angle, pressure, anticipation. In this way, stone became not just a tool, but a teacher. Some of the tools reveal something deeper, planning across time and landscape. In many desert sites, archaeologists have found core stones, with only the first few flakes removed, lightly shaped, but not completed. Why? Because these were carried unfinished, raw potential, waiting for a moment when more precise tools would be needed. This allowed mobility. Rather than carrying a full set of blades and scrapers that might break or dull, early humans carried the promise of tools, embedded in each core. These cores were, in their own way, portable futures, and sometimes, after using them, early humans left these stones behind. Not discarded, but placed, in caves, under ledges, beside animal trails, possibly as markers, possibly as gifts to their own future selves or to those who might follow. The quiet statement, "We were here. You are not alone." There is another layer to this. As toolmaking became more refined, symmetry emerged. Tools were shaped not just for function, but for form. Balanced, proportionate, almost beautiful. Some researchers argue that this symmetry may be one of the earliest expressions of symbolic thought, because symmetry is not required for survival. It is an idea, a choice, to make something beautiful when no one may ever see it. That is the beginning of art, but also of meaning. So the desert did not only test bodies, it tested minds, and stone was where the answers were written. But in a world of dryness, where even breath feels fragile beneath the sun, how does one keep thinking beyond the moment? How does one plan for a world they might never see? By trusting stone to remember. That trust, so subtle, so often overlooked, was perhaps one of the most profound shifts in the evolution of the human mind. It meant that thought could be exported, externalized. You didn't have to carry everything in your memory alone. Some of it could be stored in the edge of a blade, some of it could be left behind to be found again. This was more than a cognitive leap, it was a philosophical one. For in the stone there was permanence, a defiance of the desert's silence. Long after wind erased the tracks, long after bones returned to dust, the stone tool remained, whispering that someone had been there, someone who could imagine a future beyond their own breath. And from that whisper came something more, symbolic thought. To shape a tool was to anticipate a need. To shape it beautifully, symmetrically, gracefully, was to express something beyond function. Symmetry, after all, is not required for effectiveness, but it reflects a preference, an idea of form, an internal image projected into the world. It reflects a mind that cares not just whether something works, but how it looks. This marks the threshold of symbolism, and in the desert, where little could be wasted, that decision mattered. What does it mean that these choices were made in such a harsh environment? In places where water might vanish and game might scatter, where the sun unstitched the air by midday, humans still took time to shape tools in deliberate, elegant forms. These weren't indulgences, they were declarations of order in chaos, of vision in scarcity. We see this in the Nubian Levallois tradition, a specific style of stone tool-making found across parts of northeast Africa and Arabia. These tools, painstakingly prepared cores designed to produce sharp, triangular flakes, show not only technical skill, but abstract planning. A series of calculated strikes created predictable results. That predictability was everything. It meant that knowledge was transferable, repeatable. It meant you could teach it. And perhaps more importantly, it meant that a mental model was being followed. A concept of the tool existed before the tool itself. In other words, the mind had begun to simulate, to build futures in imagination before carving them into matter. This is not a trivial threshold. It is the root of art, of science, of language, of storytelling. The ability to hold a vision, to shape the world according to it, and to pass that vision on to others. So stone became more than survival. It became philosophy in flint. Each blade, each scraper, each flake peeled from a core was not just a means to an end. It was a statement. I know this place. I know what it can do. I know what I will need, and I can prepare for it, even if I cannot see it yet. The desert tested that faith, but stone remembered it. And because it remembered, early humans could build lives on its promises. They could look beyond the next ridge, beyond the next week, and believe that their preparation had meaning. In a world without permanence, where water dried up, herds disappeared, and even the stars were only seasonal companions, stone offered continuity. It held the imprint of foresight, and through that foresight the desert was no longer a void. It became a canvas. Because with each shaped core, each reworked edge, a truth was taking form. The tool was not the end of the thought, it was the beginning. A blade might become a scraper, a point, a burren. It could be broken and sharpened again. A piece of stone, prepared weeks before, might finally meet its purpose during a hunt or at the birth of a child, or while fashioning another tool. This recursive loop, where thought shaped tools and tools reshaped thought, helped forge a brain not just wired for survival, but for strategy, for imagination, for narrative. That's where the desert in all its brutality became a kind of crucible, not for the body but for the mind, for symbolic reasoning, for memory that outlasted the individual, for teaching, for culture, and perhaps even for meaning. We don't find art in these early desert camps, not the kind etched in caves or painted in ochre, but we do find regularity, repetition, patterns, cores placed deliberately in familiar spots, tools cached in the same places used in the same ways, and while we cannot say with certainty that these actions were ritualistic, they hint at something beyond necessity. They hint at significance. The line between a toolkit and a culture is thin. Both are inherited, both evolve, both allow one generation to reach beyond its own time, and in a desert, where almost nothing lasts, the most profound gesture may have been the creation of something that does. A flake that will still cut after the hand that made it is gone. A pattern of use that others can follow, even if they never meet the original maker. These tools were continuity in a world of collapse. So when we speak of endurance, of how early humans survived in heat without shelter, with little water and fewer certainties, we must speak of the stones. Because they are not just artifacts, they are ancestors. They are the quiet breath of cognition made visible, the language of heat and time and scarcity spoken in edges and flakes. They are the story of a mind learning to look ahead, a mind not content with now. They remind us that the future, our future, was first imagined in firelit circles, with hands wrapped around the weight of memory, the shape of stone. And so the desert, for all its emptiness, gave us something enduring, a kind of vision, one chipped into the bones of the earth, a vision that still waits, buried in sand, whispering to those who know how to listen. In a world without roofs, shade was not built, it was found, or more precisely followed. For early humans crossing the breathless heat of Paleolithic deserts, there were no walls to retreat behind, no houses to shelter in. The idea of fixed architecture, of permanent structures rooted to a single place, had not yet taken shape. What existed instead was something quieter, more fluid, a language of movement, improvisation, and impermanence. Shade, in these ancient landscapes, was not a structure, it was a strategy. But how do you seek protection in a place designed to strip it away? The deserts of ancient Africa and Arabia were not endless dunes alone. They were mosaics, shifting arrangements of gravel plains, seasonal wadis, basalt flows, and rocky escarpments. And among these, early humans learned to read shadow as if it were a resource, a slant of stone that held darkness a few hours longer, a patch of grass that signalled hidden moisture, a dip in the ground where night's coolness lingered past dawn. These were not shelters, but signals. Still, there were times when nature offered nothing, and in those moments the ingenuity of the human body was matched by the ingenuity of the human hand. Animal hides, long before they clothed bodies, shaded minds. When stitched together or stretched across branches, they created small, transportable pockets of darkness. A windbreak in a sun-beaten gully, a lean-to pressed against a rock face. Not homes, never homes, but moments of mercy. Not architecture in the modern sense, but memory-made fabric. The hide of an antelope was more than protection. It was a story of a hunt, a relationship with prey, a piece of the living landscape repurposed into survival. And vegetation, scarce though it was, also offered a kind of transient shelter. Not in thick forests or lush oases, but in the rare clumps of acacia or tamarisk that dotted the margins of ancient riverbeds. These were not groves so much as events, gatherings of shade around which life pivoted. To rest beneath one was to feel the edge of the impossible made tangible. How often must early humans have built their movement around these vegetal anchors, measuring their days by the line between light and leaf? But even more telling than what was used to create shade is when and how people chose to move. For in this language of shade, time is a speaker too. Movement was not constant, it was choreographed. In the open, under the yawning sky, shade became mobile not because it travelled with the people, but because the people learned to travel with it. They rose in the blue chill before dawn, when the ground still remembered night. They walked as long as the light remained gentle, then found stillness before the sun grew cruel. And again, in the whispering hours of dusk they moved once more. So shade was not merely something to find, it was something to follow, a rhythm written into the day itself. But what happens when the rhythm breaks, when shade no longer follows form, but creature? Early humans did not walk alone across the desert. They moved in ecosystems, bound to the migrations of other species, hoofed shadows that in their own way knew where the shade lived. Herd animals like gazelles, oryx, and ancient relatives of the ibex became not only prey, but guides. Where they moved, water moved. Where water pooled, vegetation clustered. Where vegetation clustered, shade bloomed. To follow herds across the Paleolithic landscape was to follow the pattern of relief. Even without shelter, the human body could endure, as long as there were pauses. Shade was not permanent, but predictable. Seasonal migrations often traced ancient corridors of survivability, routes where the return of rains would briefly awaken the land, coaxing out bursts of life in the form of flowers, grasses, and groves. In the green Sahara phases, these routes were rich and expansive. In dry phases, they shrank, becoming tight threads across a vast and bright canvas. Behaviourally, this required sensitivity, a willingness to adapt, to learn not only from the land, but from the lives of animals who knew it more intimately. The difference between a successful journey and a withering death could lie in understanding the signs: dung freshly dropped, browsed leaves, hoof prints pressed into soft silt, their edges still sharp. These signs weren't just clues, they were instructions. In this landscape, shade was not a destination. It was a moving promise, a trail of absence that had to be kept up with, and that meant keeping time with other beings, adjusting one's own rhythms to the pulse of creatures who had no language for sharing, only movement for showing. That quiet synchrony between human and herd, heat and shelter, required flexibility not just of foot but of thought. Ephemeral shade meant ephemeral choices. You couldn't rely on yesterday's path. The same branch wouldn't shade you twice. This fostered a mind skilled in improvisation, observation, and quick revision. If a wadi was dry, you found another. If an acacia grove was stripped by camels or beetles, you learned to rest behind boulders. If no rock or plant could shield you, you learned to become the shade, cloaking your body in skins, digging shallow pits where the earth's belly still held a whisper of cool. These acts, small, reactive, often unnoticed, reveal a deeper truth. Early humans didn't just inhabit the desert. They negotiated with it, hour by hour. Improvisation became not a weakness, but a strength. There was no blueprint for surviving in such volatility, only a continuous conversation between need and possibility. And in that conversation, the idea of shade changed. It became something fluid, something that moved not just across the land, but through the choices of those who sought it. It was in this elusive pursuit that early humans began to master one of the desert's most unforgiving lessons. You survive not by shaping the world to your will, but by shaping your will to the world. And so, with each shadow lost and found, a new kind of intelligence was forming. Not an intelligence of structures or permanence, but one rooted in agility, the ability to revise, to let go, to reconfigure thought as quickly as the wind shifted across the dunes. It was the intelligence of flexibility, a kind of cognitive looseness that allowed humans to pivot their behaviours in response to subtle environmental signals. This behavioural plasticity was not merely useful, it was essential. In the desert, the conditions changed not only from season to season, but from hour to hour. A cool morning could dissolve into a deadly noon. A path traversable at dawn could become an oven by midday. You could not survive by doing what had always worked before. You had to be ready to do what works now. In this way, shade became less a place and more a practice, a set of habits tuned to the shifting moods of the land. Early humans developed behaviours that were themselves shelter, resting postures that minimise surface area exposed to sun, strategies for grouping bodies to reduce shared thermal load, methods of wrapping themselves in plant matter or wet hides, carried over from scarce waterholes to create evaporative cooling. These were not inventions in the industrial sense, but adaptations honed through generations of trial, memory, and subtle refinement. Some evidence of these behaviours is indirect, inferred through the spatial patterns in archaeological sites. In places like the Dhofar region of Oman or the dry lake basins of the eastern Sahara, we find clusters of stone tools, hearths, and butchered animal remains, all arranged in ways that suggest temporary stops, short rests, and mobile camps. The absence of permanent shelter is not absence of strategy. It is instead a signature of people who understood that survival in the desert meant learning to keep moving, to never carry more than you needed, to build nothing that couldn't be left behind. But even in their impermanence, these strategies carried depth. They required foresight, social coordination, and shared learning. You couldn't teach your children to rely on a cave that wouldn't be there next week. Instead, you taught them to look, to notice the angle of the sun, the shape of a tree's shadow at different hours, the coolness of the earth beneath certain rocks. You taught them the language of shade, not as a fixed vocabulary, but as a living dialect of signs and responses. This ability to improvise, this openness to a future that could not be predicted, may have been one of the greatest adaptations of all. It made humans not just desert survivors, but students of its logic. They didn't try to outbuild the heat. They learned to dance with it, and in that dance, they found something rare: the ability to live in a world without guarantees. The desert taught them that comfort was not a constant, but a moving point of balance, and that to reach it, you had to be ready to change direction at any moment. This readiness, to adapt without warning, to shift without regret, was more than a survival tactic. It was a world view, a way of inhabiting a land that did not offer mercy, only possibility. And in this worldview, shade was more than coolness. It was meaning. It was also relational. Shade did not exist independently. It required attention. You had to notice it. You had to remember where it had been and guess where it might be again. In this way, shade trained memory. It shaped the mind towards spatial thinking, mental maps, and environmental foresight. Not abstract knowledge, but embodied, intuitive, practiced over years of walking the same ravines, sitting under the same overhangs, marking the slow shift of the sun across the edge of a dune. It is in this space between body and environment that the human mind came to know improvisation not as randomness, but as precision. Not as guessing, but as adapting in real time, based on deeply familiar cues. You learn to carry shade in your choices, to measure it in your timing, to make decisions not around what you had, but what you knew to seek. And this knowledge was not held alone. It moved through groups. A child didn't learn shade from books. They learned it by walking. By squinting at the same sky as their elders, lying belly down in the same strips of shadow beneath thorn trees, watching where others stopped and where they didn't. In this way, shade became cultural, not fixed like architecture, but flowing like memory past mouth to ear, step to step. And though we think of shelters as the markers of intelligence, perhaps what the desert shows us is that flexibility is its own form of genius. That a structure is not always built from stone or wood. It can be made of movement, timing, and knowing where not to go. In fact, some of the most powerful shade used by early humans was created not by materials at all, but by time, by pausing, by waiting, by sheltering in stillness rather than in space. Consider the practice of crepuscular movement, travelling at dawn and dusk, those two liminal windows when the sun is low and the ground briefly forgiving. These were not just cooler hours, they were tactical decisions woven into the rhythms of body and land. The humans who understood this were not simply conserving energy. They were respecting the desert's tempo, stepping in and out of its heat like breath. This timing-based strategy gave them the ability to cross vast, exposed spaces with minimal heat damage. It also gave them rhythm, a cycle of action and pause, motion and rest, that allowed for recovery and recalibration. That rhythm itself was a kind of shelter, an architecture of time. And so, in a landscape where nothing stood still, early humans became architects of the invisible. Their structures were made of shadow, memory and rhythm, structures that left no footprints, no walls, no ceilings, no permanent address. And yet, what greater architecture could there be, in a land always shifting, than the ability to remain alive within it? When we think of shelter, we tend to imagine something solid, something we can touch. But in the open deserts of prehistory, survival came not from building things, but from building relationships, with heat, with time, with the transient touch of relief. Shade wasn't permanent, it didn't promise protection tomorrow. But for those brief moments when it could be found, it became a quiet covenant, a reprieve earned not by conquest, but by understanding. And in these moments, early humans developed not just tools and techniques, but trust. Trust in their group to share knowledge of where the next cluster of trees might be. Trust in their instincts to read the wind, the light, the slope of the land. Trust that though the desert offered little, it would always offer something if you moved wisely and waited long enough. Even the improvisational shelters, hide-draped branches, palm-thatch bundles, low-walled windbreaks of stone, were never permanent. They were made to be left, to dissolve back into the landscape once the sun moved on. Their impermanence wasn't failure, it was design. Because permanence is a burden when the land itself will not stay still. Instead, what these early humans cultivated was a form of shelter that lived within. Knowledge held in the body, experience encoded in muscle and footfall and gaze. You didn't need to carry your shelter if your mind carried the map. And when viewed through this lens, we begin to see that shade was never just about temperature. It was about the ability to pause, to catch breath, to stay just long enough to recover, to think, to make the next move wisely. And in those pauses, something extraordinary was happening. The emergence of consciousness shaped by terrain. The desert demanded not just reaction, but reflection. When to move, when to wait, when to risk the open, and when to double back. These were not random decisions. They required a kind of desert calculus, balancing exhaustion, sunlight, group health, and what might lie just over the next rise. And so, even in a place without walls, humans found ways to build patterns, behaviours that stabilised life just enough to survive, but stayed fluid enough to avoid being broken by change. That's what the language of shade truly is, the art of negotiation with the present, a set of soft agreements between human and heat, light and shadow, presence and absence. No blueprints were needed, just eyes to see and the memory to know where to walk next. And perhaps that is the quiet brilliance of these early desert people. Not that they built shelter, but that they didn't have to. They learned to live in the gaps, in the flickers, in the breath between brightness and dark, and in doing so, they endured. There were no roads, no signposts, no names carved into stone, and yet across a sea of shifting sand and fractured rock, early humans moved with purpose, steadily, repeatedly, across unimaginable distances. How? How do you chart a world that offers no lines? How do you know where to go when the land itself erases every footprint? To survive in the desert was to see the landscape not as a blank canvas, but as a living memory. A memory stored not in ink or paint, but in the mind, and more remarkably in the body. Every step, every breath, every horizon was etched into a cognitive map so rich and so fluid that even today, with all our satellites and screens, we struggle to replicate its grace. These were not maps as we know them. There was no north, no fixed scale. Instead, they were webs of remembered sensations, the angle of a distant dune under moonlight, the echo of a call near a particular outcrop, the feel of cooler soil beneath a certain kind of tree. Landmarks were not static. They were temporal, revealed only at certain times of day or in particular seasons. A single rock might be invisible in the harsh light of noon but cast a guiding shadow at dusk. And so, memory was not just spatial, it was rhythmic. It danced with time. And what is memory without story? To preserve and pass on these intricate landscapes, early humans leaned on a power more enduring than stone, oral tradition. Elders became living archives, their voices shaping invisible threads across vast spaces. A waterhole was not just a place, it was a tale of a journey, of survival, of a child born or a storm survived. These stories, passed from one tongue to another, were not diversions, they were direction. And still, even the most practiced memory needs more than what is stored inside. The sky, too, was a partner. Celestial bodies, especially the moon and stars, became navigational anchors. In regions without mountains or forests, the constellations turned the heavens into a kind of map, one that rotated slowly but predictably across the year. The position of Orion just above the horizon could whisper when it was time to move east. The rising of Venus before dawn could signal the alignment of seasons, migrations, and migrations of prey. These cues did not speak in words, but they guided all the same. And so, without parchment, without roads, without names, early humans stitched together paths invisible to all but those who knew how to see. A bent tree, a line of stones, the way a shadow curved around a boulder, each one a thread in a vast, unspoken tapestry of direction. But how did they remember so much? How did they hold 1,000 miles in their minds without losing the way? What happens to a mind when its very survival depends on never forgetting the land that never stops changing? The answer lies in the shaping of a particular kind of mind, one not only capable of memory, but designed for it. Evolution favoured those who could hold landscapes in their heads like stories, not in abstraction but in layers, scent, sound, light, and angle. The desert doesn't repeat itself, so every remembered feature had to be contextual, alive within the rhythms of time and season. Cognitive mapping, the ability to mentally picture the environment and anticipate one's position within it, was not exclusive to humans. Many animals do it. Birds, wolves, elephants, they all carry maps in their minds. But what set early humans apart was the sheer scale and abstraction of those maps. Not only could they remember the path behind them, they could imagine paths ahead, paths they had never walked, but only heard about. This was the spark of something new, an imaginative geography, a world constructed from both experience and trust, in the words of others. And this trust was earned. You didn't follow someone's story about a distant waterhole lightly. Belief could mean survival or death. Oral navigation was rooted in shared trial, and every retelling refined the mental terrain. The maps were not static. They evolved with each journey, each deviation. The more people who walked a path, the deeper it wore into the collective memory. These pathways were also encoded in ritual and rhythm. Songs were used as navigational aids, not as entertainment, but as mnemonic devices. Aboriginal songlines in Australia give us a powerful analogy. Melodic narratives tied to real features in the land, where verses correspond to creeks, hills, or stony plains. Though separated by thousands of years and continents, it is likely that prehistoric humans in Africa and Arabia developed similar methods. A hum sung at a certain tempo, a chant repeated with each footstep could encode a journey of days into something repeatable, reliable, and shareable. Overhead, the sky continued its slow rotation, always whispering its steady directions. Unlike the land below, the stars do not lie. Even today, the same constellations that guided those ancient walkers still burn above us. In the desert, where night skies bloom unpolluted, the stars become not just a map but a calendar. Lunar cycles told them when game would be moving. The tilt of Orion's belt could signal the change in prevailing winds. The Milky Way itself, stretching from horizon to horizon, offered a celestial spine by which one could orient across months of migration. Even the horizon, the subtle rise and fall of distant terrain, was encoded with cues. A break in the dune line might hint at a pass. A smudge of green far off could signal a hidden spring. These indicators were not random. They were watched, remembered, compared, and slowly added to the growing archive of communal survival. Because in a world with no roads, memory was the only compass, and the body was the only vehicle it could ride. And what a vehicle it became! Every tendon, every joint, every strand of muscle became an instrument not just of movement, but of perception. The act of walking itself was mnemonic, a practice in remembering. Feet met ground with rhythm and feel, sensing subtle changes in incline, texture, temperature. A soft patch underfoot might recall a previous resting place. A gravel-strewn slope might echo a route taken during the dry season, when water had retreated into distant gullies. The desert does not allow for passive movement. There are no lazy steps. Each stride must be chosen. And in that choosing, the human mind grew sharper, more attuned to place. To walk was to remember, and to remember was to survive. But memory alone was not enough. It had to be shared. Navigation, true navigation, was a social art. One person might remember the path to the hidden spring. Another might have passed it down from their parent, layered with cautionary tales. Do not walk past the three-fingered hill when the wind smells of metal. Turn where the ground curves like a sleeping animal. These were not metaphors. They were coordinates, lyrical, emotional, embodied. This transmission of navigational knowledge marked the birth of something fundamental, proto-culture, a collective repository of survival, held not in stone or parchment, but in story, gesture, and communal recall. And in this oral culture, navigation became one of the first great cooperative human enterprises. Not just where to go, but how to get there together without losing anyone along the way. And remarkably, even children became part of this mapping. From an early age, they were included in the daily rituals of observation. Ask questions. Which way does the wind come from in the evening? Do you see where the birds are circling? These were the foundational lessons passed not in schoolrooms, but in the open heat. Children learned by doing, walking beside their elders, repeating the stories, tracing the horizon with squinted eyes and dry fingers. There were mistakes, of course. There were moments of being lost, and in those moments, humans learned humility in the face of space, but they also learned recovery, the ability to reorient based on the sky, to listen for distant calls, to find again the faint groove in the sand left by an earlier footfall. And perhaps most crucially, they learned when to wait, when movement would only compound the error. This was not just navigation. It was an intimate relationship with change. No map was ever final, no direction ever absolute. What mattered was fluidity, the ability to shift perspective, to update knowledge, to remember not just the place, but the conditions under which that place could be found. The desert gave no forgiveness, but it did give patterns, and those who survived were those who could read them, memorize them, and pass them forward, not as facts, but as living threads of guidance woven into the mind. And once woven, these paths lived there, not just for an hour or a season, but across generations. The remarkable thing about early desert navigation was not only the skill of the individual, but the endurance of shared memory. For these were not maps for one life, they were maps for many. A landscape remembered by a group became more than a set of directions, it became a form of inheritance, and with that inheritance came resilience. When one elder fell silent, another voice rose to carry the stories. The waterhole behind the black cliff, the pass that only opened when the sun was lowest in the sky, the night wind that always came before the rains. These fragments, each stored in someone's memory, formed a kind of collective cartography, redundant, overlapping, and strong. In this way, navigation became an act of trust as much as perception. You relied on others to remember what you could not. This interdependence made early navigation a cultural glue. It demanded listening. It encouraged mentorship. It rewarded generosity and knowledge sharing. In environments where a wrong turn could mean death, Hoarding direction was unthinkable. To remember was a gift. To pass it on was a duty. And yet, for all its social roots, this proto-navigation was also deeply personal. Each person, over time, came to build their own private constellation of reference points. A certain rock formation seen only when crouched just so. A tree that looked different after a storm. A subtle scent on the wind that told of damp soil and potential refuge. These observations, subtle and often inexpressible, created inner landscapes, intuitive senses of orientation shaped by the fusion of feeling and fact. One might even say that in these ancient minds, place itself was no longer separate from person. To know the desert was to become part of its memory, an extension of its contours, its rhythms, its rules. The self was no longer merely moving through the world, it was woven into it as thread through fabric. And it wasn't just the land that formed these invisible maps. Time, especially in the desert, was a navigational partner. The angle of the sun at dawn, the softness of air before a storm, even the behaviour of animals mark the shifting calendar. When birds circled differently, or ants closed their trails too early, the walker took note. The map shifted slightly, a different path chosen. And when all else failed, when night fell, and no feature could be seen, the stars remained, reliable, ancient, and silent. In the cold silence of desert dark, those glittering pinpricks became not just markers, but companions. Ancient humans watched the same skies we do, but with a different urgency. For them, Orion's tilt wasn't poetic, it was instructive. It said, "You're on the right path," or warned, "You've drifted too far." It is tempting to think of these skills as primitive, but they weren't. They were precise, they were practiced, they were honed in the crucible of heat and need. And from that crucible emerged a kind of genius, an intelligence shaped not by numbers or written coordinates, but by attention. To live without maps was not to be lost, but to be constantly engaged. Every glance, every step, every shift in light was a dialogue with the land. The human brain, evolved over millennia, became a navigation engine powered by story, sensation, and silence. This was not a static skill. It demanded continual calibration. If the winds shifted, the walker shifted too. If a new line of dunes swallowed an old landmark, the memory adapted, looping around, making space for this erasure. No two journeys were ever the same, but the relationship between mind and world remained constant. Perhaps this is what made early desert navigation so profound. It required presence. You could not drift or disappear into thought. You had to be there, with the wind against your skin, the dust in your throat, and the land unfolding in real time. It was a form of mindfulness not practiced, but necessary, woven into the very practice of survival. And so, navigation became not just a physical task, but a philosophical one. To walk the desert without a map was to accept uncertainty, to live by rhythm and trust. It was to understand that the world could not always be controlled, but it could be known, intimately, respectfully, through memory and through movement. This chapter in our deep history reminds us of something vital, that the mind is not separate from the world it perceives. For early humans, the terrain outside shaped the terrain within. The brain grew around the needs of movement, orientation, and social transmission. In this way, the desert did not merely test humanity, it helped shape it. In modern times, we lean on devices to tell us where we are. Blue dots on screens, arrows pointing to destinations. But these tools, while useful, sever us from the ancient intimacy of wayfinding. They remove the challenge, and in doing so, strip away the wonder. Imagine instead standing alone under a velvet night sky, the Milky Way curling overhead, and knowing, through nothing but memory and starlight, how to find your way home. That is the gift our ancestors cultivated. Not a map, but a mind tuned to the Earth's frequencies. Not a compass, but a story whispered on the wind. And in the end, perhaps it wasn't about arriving at a destination. Perhaps it was about the act of moving through, of being awake to the journey, of seeing every stone and shadow as a kind of friend. In the pathless world of early deserts, humans didn't just survive. They navigated, with grace, with intelligence, and with a profound sense of place. In the vast silence they left no signs behind. Only the quiet echo of memory passed from foot to foot, across time. In the desert night, when the heat collapses into cold and the sky unveils its ancient star-pierced ceiling, there is no door to close, no wall to lean against. The horizon remains open, endless. Vulnerability is everywhere. And into this vast and fragile dark, early humans brought something miraculous. Fire. Not just warmth, not merely light, but a presence. A controlled sun held close to the earth, a kind of shade in reverse. Fire was never a shelter in the architectural sense, but it offered protection nonetheless. In a land with no ceilings, fire drew a circle, a psychological perimeter. Beyond its glow, the world remained wild, unknowable. But within its flickering radius, the ground felt inhabited, claimed, made safe. In desert regions, where daytime sun could kill, night became an opportunity, a reversal. With fire, early humans could travel, rest, and plan in the cool darkness. The oppressive weight of the day lifted, replaced by the cool clarity of stars and flame. Fire allowed the human rhythm to shift. It decoupled survival from daylight. This wasn't just adaptation, it was invention. Controlling fire in open, arid landscapes is no simple task. Winds are unpredictable, fuel is sparse, sand swallows sparks, and yet archaeological traces from places like the Clambo Falls site in Africa or hearths from the Levantine corridor show evidence of repeated intentional fire use. Charcoal layers, burned bones, thermally altered stone all point to fire as a tool not just discovered but mastered. And desert fire had its own techniques. The kindling was chosen for dryness and slow burn, twisted shrubs. Dry camel thorn, cracked grass stems. Arranged in low, wind-protected hollows or ringed by stone, fires were carefully tended. Ash was sometimes saved, used to insulate coals for morning reignition. In this way, fire became semi-permanent, carried not just in hands but in memory, habit and foresight. And in carrying fire, humans began carrying time. Each ember contained hours of stored sunlight. Each flame transformed the chaos of night into continuity, extending activity into darkness, weaving presence into absence. More than a survival mechanism, fire became a threshold. Between danger and safety, between isolation and communion, it gathered people. Around it, the human voice softened, hands gestured in silhouette, eyes met in flicker and shadow, and something else happened too, something subtle. Fire offered a chance to sit still. In a landscape that demanded constant motion, tracking, hunting, seeking, fire invited pause, a moment of stillness, warmth, and visibility. And in that pause, a new kind of experience emerged, reflection. The mind, no longer focused only on escape or direction, could now wander, could now remember. The fire made memory visible. In this chapter, we'll explore how flame, this small, controlled rupture in the desert night, became more than heat or signal. It became a social axis, a temporal anchor, and a technological spell that rewrote the relationship between humans and night. A kind of architecture made not of matter, but of light. Because in a world without shelter, fire became a way to make space feel like home. But fire did more than warm the skin. It warmed the space between. It shaped the cadence of conversation, the tempo of trust. In that glowing ring, early humans found not just comfort, but connection. Fire gathered them into something new, a circle, and circles are special. They draw the gaze inward. They equalize. There's no front, no back, no hidden corners. Around a fire, even silence feels shared. It is here, within that ancient circle, that culture begins to thicken. Imagine a group of desert wanderers, dust on their ankles, the wind still in their hair, settling for the night. The fire is coaxed into being, sparks flicker, shadows stretch, and then from the quiet someone speaks. A sound, a phrase, maybe a name. Perhaps it's a tale of where the water lay last season, or how the stars shifted before the last big wind. Or maybe it's not information, but story, a remembered event transformed into something shaped, repeated, embellished. This is the origin of oral tradition, not carved into stone, not painted on cave walls, but shared in breath and rhythm beside flame. Fire was not just warmth, it was audience. It created the conditions for listening, for repetition, for pause and gesture. It allowed memory to become performance, and through that performance, memory became more resilient. Stories learned by heart could be passed from elder to child, surviving long after the teller was gone. And in this act of storytelling, something remarkable unfolded: planning. The desert did not permit chaos. It required anticipation. Around the fire, early humans could imagine the day ahead, trace the paths of herds, recall the taste of water from a distant spring. The flickering light became a backdrop for shared foresight, a kind of prototypical meeting space. As relevant to survival as any tool, this is what scholars call the firelight niche, a unique behavioural window opened by the presence of flame. Unlike daylight hours, which were spent gathering, walking, hunting, and watching for danger, the firelight hours were quieter, safer, cognitively richer. They were filled with storytelling, memory rehearsal, social grooming and teaching. And unlike sun or moon, fire could be moved. It wasn't fixed. It travelled with the group, lighting the same minds that had carried it across the sand. In this way, it became an extension of the self, not just a tool, but a bearer of continuity. In desert environments, where the openness of the landscape could overwhelm, fire created a small interiority, a sense of inside, even when there were no walls. Around it, people could let their guard down, sleep in shifts, share food without scanning the dark, and it's no accident that fire remains central to so many human rituals today. Campfires, candles, hearths, all trace their ancestry to this ancient practice, the gathering of minds around a fragile, flickering flame. Because in a world ruled by heat and silence, fire was not a symbol of survival. It was a symbol of belonging. And in the shifting rhythms of Paleolithic desert life, belonging was not just emotional, it was existential. Isolation was risk, fragmentation was death. But fire pulled people inward, into small bands of shared presence, shared heat, and shared knowledge. And most profoundly, it gave shape to the night. Day in the desert was relentless. The sun bore down with near-violent indifference. Skin burned, eyes squinted, water vanished. But night? Night was something else. It was generous, expansive, cool. And with fire, night became not a void, but a canvas. For desert-dwelling humans, fire reversed the tyranny of daylight. It granted freedom in hours otherwise cloaked in fear. When the ground finally cooled, when predators withdrew, when the sun's eye closed, the fire opened its own. This shift was more than biological. It was behavioural. It was philosophical. We began, perhaps for the first time, to prefer the night. With fire, the night was no longer just a pause between days. It became a time of strategy, connection, even joy. Food could be cooked, transforming not only nutrition, but taste. Bones could be softened, marrow accessed, parasites in meat could be destroyed. Fireside meals weren't just safer, they were more satisfying, and over shared food came shared thinking. It's here in the firelight hours that imagination quietly took root. The brain, freed from immediate physical demands, could roam, could wonder, could picture things not currently visible. It could remember the past, but also project futures, where the animals might migrate, where the next waterhole could be found, what danger might lie beyond a new hill. The flames, ever shifting, mirrored this new internal movement. This wasn't just cognition, it was symbolism beginning to stir. Some archaeologists suggest that around fire, humans may have first played with sound. Rhythms tapped on stone, vocal games, mimicry. Others point to early pigments and ochres found near hearth sites, hinting at cosmetic or ritual behaviour tied to firelight. These were not necessities. They were expressions, small, flickering signs that the human mind was stepping beyond mere survival. The fire didn't just push back the dark, it revealed what lay inside us. In this sense, it's no surprise that so many origin myths across human cultures begin with fire, or guard its secrets with reverence. Fire was our first portal, our first tool of transformation, not just of the world outside, but of the world within. And perhaps most curiously, fire did not dominate the desert. It fit within it. It needed to be tended, watched, respected. It could not outshine the stars or compete with the sun. It was a humble brilliance, temporary, flickering and intimate. But in that small brilliance, humans carved out something astonishing, a space to think, to share, to remember. And in remembering, to become more than just creatures of need, to become beings of meaning. Because when the world cooled and the sky opened wide, the fire within us finally had room to speak. There is something deeply paradoxical about the firelight niche. It gave birth to our stillness, but also to our movement. Fire allowed rest, yes, but it also prepared us for the next day's journey. It let us rehearse possibilities, weigh risks, whisper secrets of the terrain. Around it, plans were hatched in low voices, gestures mirrored in flame. Desert life required motion. No river valley or dense forest could hold a group in place for long, but at night, fire gave us a place, a pause in the drift, and from that pause, clarity. Fire may not leave grand fossils, it does not petrify, but it leaves signatures, thermally fractured rock, ash lenses layered through sand, bones darkened with carbon, arranged hearth circles. In places like Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dating back nearly 780,000 years, or the Blombos Cave in South Africa, fire's legacy lingers like the faint outline of a vanished camp. These were not chaotic burn sites. They show control, reuse, spatial organisation. Some fire pits were used repeatedly, likely assigned social function, cooking, warmth, craft, gathering. This implies memory of place. People remembered where the fire was and chose to return. In the desert, where geography often deceives and shifts, such memory became powerful. Fire could serve as a kind of landmark, a behavioural waypoint embedded in space, and there is reason to believe fire became symbolic even in the absence of visible flame. Ashes, when cooled, were not merely discarded. They may have been spread on the ground to insulate sleeping areas or used to mark territory. These gestures hint at a growing awareness of environment, not as enemy, but as canvas. The desert was not only crossed, it was interpreted, and fire was the first interpreter. In some regions, stone tools were heat-treated in fire, blades hardened, flints prepared with deliberate exposure to heat. This required not only knowledge, but a sequence of actions, anticipation, steps, planning. This is why fire isn't just a practical breakthrough, it is a cognitive revolution. The ability to gather fuel in advance, to protect flame against wind, to build a hearth, to share it with others, and to think beyond its glow. This is the architecture of a mind awakening to time, to contingency, to story. And as groups moved, the knowledge of fire moved with them. Children would have watched elders prepare tinder, seen the spark leapt from flint to grass, smelled the shift from smoke to flame. They would have absorbed this not as lesson, but as ritual. This transmission of fire-making was not taught like a lecture. It was lived, day after day, night after night. Its rhythms seeped into the body, the breath, the expectations of dusk. It was the first great choreography of culture. And in this dance, the firelight became a metronome, keeping time not just through heat or light, but through memory. A memory passed not by marks, but by presence. In the long twilight of the prehistoric world, presence was survival, and fire, though born of spark and tinder, was ultimately sustained by attention, by the act of staying near, of feeding it not just with wood, but with awareness. It asked for vigilance. It rewarded care, and through that shared attention, it began to shape something precious. Trust. Trust that others would keep the fire alive through the night. Trust that in its circle, dangers could be seen. Trust that knowledge would be remembered and shared. This trust was the quiet foundation of early human social life. Not contracts, not written laws, just flame and the unspoken understanding that keeping it alive meant keeping us alive. Fire demanded us to become stewards, not only of heat, but of time itself. For in the desert, where the environment gave little margin for error, the fire became an internal clock. It taught early humans about rhythm. The rhythm of fuel burning down, of the body cooling, of the stars turning overhead. And in that rhythm, people began to speak of tomorrow. The hearth at night became the first classroom, the first parliament, the first chapel. It was where knowledge was spoken into existence, where it could be corrected, added to, remembered. It was where children sat wide-eyed, learning about places they'd never seen, animals they might one day hunt, mistakes that had once cost dearly. It was not just functional, it was formational. Even today, echoes of this ancient intimacy remain. We gather around bonfires, candles, campfires, not simply to stay warm, but to feel close, to slow down, to remember some older cadence of being human. We instinctively lower our voices in firelight, speak more softly, more slowly. We tell stories. We fall quiet. The fire within is not gone. It's in our traditions, our ceremonies, our metaphors. We talk of burning passion, inner light, smouldering anger. We light candles for the dead, lanterns for the lost, torches for celebration. All these are linguistic embers, signs that the fire that once burned in the open air of prehistoric deserts still lives inside the architecture of our language. And so this chapter, like the flame it describes, does not end in triumph or conclusion. It ends in continuation. Because fire is not static. It passes from hand to hand, heart to heart. It is reborn every time we seek one another's warmth, not just in heat, but in attention. In the desert, early humans endured the unendurable. They found shade in flame, shelter in openness, connection in silence. They transformed night from emptiness into invitation, and in doing so they kindled not just fire but the first true human space, a space of meaning, of memory, of possibility. A space where the outside world paused long enough for the inside world to grow, where the fire without and the fire within began to burn as one. The wind is a constant editor, erasing the margins, scattering the footnotes. Rain rarely falls, but when it does so with fury, sweeping away the brittle and the buried alike. There is no thick blanket of forest mulch, no sedimentary cradle of riverbanks to hold the delicate imprints of time. What survives in the desert is only what clings most stubbornly to existence: stone, flint, and sometimes bone. Yet from these few remains, an entire world murmurs. Somewhere between the dunes of the central Sahara, amid the red stone scatter of the Arabian Nafud and the wind-polished flats of the eastern desert, fragments emerge, a worked flake here, a splintered femur there, often unaccompanied, often alone. The archaeological record in such places is thin, fragmented and cruelly selective. But what does it mean to find something in a place where almost nothing should remain? It begins with distribution, patterns too subtle for the casual glance, but unmistakable to those who have learned the terrain's language. A single point might speak of nothing, but a cluster, 3 or 4 tools of the same technological lineage, aligned along a dried wadi, or spread across the leeward side of a now eroded escarpment, begins to speak not of accident, but of habit. These were not random droppings. They were traces of paths once walked, of camps once built, of hands once busy with the quiet labour of staying alive. Why did they stop here? In the heat and barrenness? Why did they nap obsidian at the edge of an empty plain, or leave a trail of bladelets along a salt-crusted basin? The tools speak, but softly. They do not say who, they do not say how many, but they whisper of decision, of presence, of repetition. And so the archaeologist becomes something between detective and priest, interpreting these echoes not as isolated artifacts, but as syllables in an ancient sentence. A blade of Levallois flint, sharp and symmetrical, suggests not just utility but tradition, a way of making that was taught, repeated, and preserved over generations. An antelope radius bearing cut marks, its ends split for marrow, reveals a diet plan adapted not to abundance, but to the brutal math of scarcity. The placement of these items, relative to each other, and to the contours of the land, offers clues about how our ancestors moved through space and how space moved through them. But for every find, there is a silence. For every flake, 100 camps vanished. For every fossilized joint, 1,000 bodies were consumed by scavengers or dissolved into the earth with no trace. Absence is not a void. It is a mirror. It reminds us that most of human history is not preserved in monuments or bones, but in the choices made when no one was watching. The desert does not record lives like a library. It holds them like a sieve. What falls through is everything we do not yet know. What catches are the seeds of understanding. And so we ask again, what kind of life leaves so little behind, and yet so much? A life in motion. The desert does not reward permanence. It punishes wait, punishes staying too long. Early humans who dwelled in these arid corridors did not build monuments. They did not leave foundations, clay walls, or hearths carved deep into bedrock. They left instead only what they had to: a broken scraper, a cracked tibia, a crescent of charcoal buried beneath centuries of shifting sand. Their invisibility is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of mastery. They carried knowledge instead of architecture, memory instead of walls. In the open desert, to survive was to remain light. Mobility was not a choice, it was law, and mobility leaves behind only fragments. This is why so many early archaeological sites in the Sahara, the Negev, and the Rub al-Khali are not villages but scatterings, small concentrations of stone flakes, animal bones fractured for marrow, and sometimes, rarely, the faint outline of a hearth. You could walk past such a place and never know that life once pulsed there. Children learning to knap small tools from quartzite, women scraping hides, elders watching the horizon for dust storms or movement of gazelle herds. Dotted across basins, along gravel plains where ancient rivers once ran, stone tools form trails like constellations. Some belong to Homo sapiens, others to earlier cousins, Homo heidelbergensis, perhaps even late Homo erectus. Their shapes speak different dialects of the same quiet language, survival in open space, but tools alone cannot tell us how these people thought, how they organized their days, how they mourned their dead or greeted the sunrise. And yet, this is where absence becomes its own form of evidence. Because when people are highly mobile, they do not bury their dead deeply. Bodies are left to wind, scavengers, sand, unless they are given special meaning. So when we do find burials in desert margins, such as the 90,000-year-old grave at Kafsa Cave, or the ochre-stained bones from Jebel Sahaba, they are not ordinary, they are chosen. They tell us that even in a land of constant departure, some moments demanded stillness, ceremony, a pause in the journey. And in the far reaches of Arabia, near Jebel Faya and Al-Wusta, we find both stone tools and human remains beside ancient lake beds now nothing but salt. These sites are neither large nor elaborate, but they are intentional. The presence of hearth ash tells us they waited here, not for hours, but for seasons. So, what do we make of this contradiction? A people invisible in footprint yet persistent in trace? A culture that left no buildings but built memory into land? We learn that resilience does not always carve stone. Sometimes it disappears into wind, living on only in the sliver of flint, the angle of a cut mark, the arc of a footprint hardened by time. It is in these remnants, scattered, quiet, unresolved, that the desert speaks its most honest truth, that endurance is not loud. It is left in pieces, and from those pieces we reconstruct not just lives, but lifeways, habits of movement, rhythms of return, and the soft geometry of human presence across vast open lands. Here, bones and stones are more than just objects. They are signposts in a train of silence, and they begin to draw a map, not of borders or kingdoms, but of behaviours. Each fossil, when found, tells two stories. First, it tells the story of its owner, species, age, injuries, sometimes even illnesses. But second, it tells a story about its own survival, why this bone endured when so many others did not. What conditions sealed it into time? What sequence of chance and climate allowed it to pass from living tissue into mineral memory? In many desert contexts, we do not find the neat burial pits or complete skeletons that define richer archaeological layers. Instead, we find isolated remains, a single tooth perhaps, or the shaft of a long bone bearing unmistakable chop marks. But even these fragments speak volumes. A chopped femur found beside a cluster of burnt lithics suggests deliberate marrow extraction. A broken molar ground, flat on one side, reveals dietary stress, sand-laced roots perhaps, or gritty foods pounded with stone. When these remnants are plotted across the land, they begin to trace out ancient economies of movement. Imagine the hunter scanning the plain, moving from one seasonal spring to the next. Imagine the family group trailing migrating herds, returning to known shade each year when the heat peaked. These movements leave no roads, but they do leave patterns, in where tools are discarded, in which animal bones are concentrated near water, in the particular stones chosen for tool making. And then there is the absence again. At certain latitudes, near dunes where fossil water once surfaced, we find only tools, no bones. In other regions, bones but no tools. What does this mean? Were animals butchered elsewhere? Were tools carried away after use, repurposed again and again until they simply disappeared into dust? Or do these silences speak of rituals we cannot yet imagine, of places intentionally left unmarked? This is the burden and the beauty of desert archaeology. It forces humility. It reminds us that most of what happened is forever beyond recovery. But what can be known is sharpened, made clearer by the sparseness around it. A single fire pit in the emptiness speaks more loudly than 10 in a village. A lone burial in the open plain is not just a death, it is a decision, a moment where someone said, "This person mattered." We reconstruct from crumbs. We weave a human fabric from threads barely visible. We look at a handful of burnt flakes and see, not just fire, but conversation. Not just cooking, but community. Because scattered or not, these echoes in bone do not lie. They tell us something real passed through here. Something upright, aware, enduring. Something that learned not just to survive, but to remember. And memory, when it has no parchment or ink, imprints itself in behaviour, in what is carried, in what is left behind. In deserts, memory manifests not in what people say, but in how they move, where they pause, and how they adapt to repetition disguised as change. Let us look closer, then, at the traces of those pauses, at the concentrations of bone and stone that cluster along now extinct waterholes, at the shallow depressions in the earth that might once have held a post or a pile of gathered grass. These are not dwellings, they are decisions, temporary moments of rest in a world where movement was the norm, and those decisions leave a geometry we can trace. Take, for example, the spatial analysis of an ancient desert site. Scattered flakes on the edge of a dry basin, animal bone fragments concentrated to the north, and a faint lens of ash in between, not much on its own. But the pattern reveals a possible campsite layout, napping zone, butchering area, cooking or resting hearth. These were the skeletal outlines of social organisation, a temporary village etched into sand. Even when individual items are unremarkable, another flake, another burned bone, it is in their distribution that meaning emerges. Statistical clustering becomes a kind of archaeology of intention. You do not get dense patches of cut-marked gazelle bones in one corner of a site unless choices were made, repeatedly, about where to work, where to rest, and where to discard. And over time, those choices accumulate into culture. Because even in deserts, culture exists, not in paintings or towering structures, but in shared practices, in how tools are shaped and resharpened, in how animals are dismembered, in how fire is made and sustained. These things are taught, they are passed down. And when we find them fossilized, not just once, but repeatedly across different desert sites, we're not just seeing behavior, we're seeing tradition. In this way, even bone fragments and flint shavings become a form of language, a grammar of survival. Sometimes the language is interrupted, bones snapped in odd ways, burn patterns that suggest sudden departure. We see these too. They hint at danger, perhaps the presence of predators, or of rival groups, perhaps environmental stress, a spring that failed earlier than expected, a herd that veered off course. The desert was never static, and so even these disruptions become part of the story. Other times, we find persistence. sites revisited across generations. The same spot used again and again for the same task. These are not accidents. They are memory enacted over time. Even if no single person lived there long, the land itself became known, familiar, storied. A skeleton of continuity stretched across centuries. And when we kneel there today, brushing sand from a heat-split rib or lifting a flint blade dulled by time, we're not just reconstructing a moment. We are touching the residues of a map once held only in human minds. A map not of roads, but of choices. And those choices, what to carry, where to rest, how to endure, are encoded in the faintest traces, the ones most easily missed. A single obsidian flake, hundreds of kilometers from its source, tells us of movement, of exchange, of memory stretching across vast waterless expanses. Its edge, carefully retouched, tells us of planning. Not just survival, but foresight. Because that's what archaeology in deserts ultimately reveals. A mind trained on the horizon. A way of thinking tuned to the logic of impermanence. We often imagine deserts as barren, but in truth, they are layered with ghosts. Each generation layered loosely over the one before. And while humid environments tend to swallow history, soft bones decaying, footprints erased by plant roots, the desert, in its austerity, sometimes preserves better. A calcified tendon, a sun-hardened footprint, a hearth blackened into the earth. Yet, even then, what remains is a fraction of a fraction. Most desert peoples left no tombs, no temples, no lasting architecture. Their resilience lay not in permanence, but in lightness, in being able to vanish when the rains failed, to lift camp and follow the game. To move not randomly, but according to a remembered rhythm. And this is where the final paradox emerges. They endured by becoming invisible. To modernize, that invisibility can feel like absence, but it's not. It's design. It's a way of being that understood the cost of weight in a land that gives little. These early humans were not fragile. They were finely tuned. Their lives were not haphazard. They were choreography in open space. So when we find only a single jawbone, only a crescent of chipped quartz, only a bone with weather-etched tool marks, we are not finding evidence of a lesser culture. We are hearing a whisper from a kind of genius we've nearly forgotten. A genius of adaptation, of memory without writing, of structure without walls. To survive in the open desert without buildings, without storage, without fences or farms, this required not only endurance, but a particular kind of intelligence. An intimacy with land so profound it didn't need to be marked. A belonging so complete it left almost no scar. And today, in labs and field camps across the world, researchers sit hunched over trays of wind-polished bone, of silica-scarred tools, trying to reconstruct not just timelines, but lives. From fragments, they listen for laughter around an ancient fire, for footsteps pressed into wet sand 120,000 years ago, for the sound of a napper's rhythm echoing off canyon walls, echoes in bone. These are the records of a humanity that walked light, but thought deeply, who mastered some of the most unforgiving terrains on Earth not by overpowering them, but by flowing through them, who taught each generation not how to build, but how to move. And in this quiet, humble archaeology, we glimpse what may be the oldest lesson of all. To last, one must learn how to disappear without ever being lost. But to disappear wisely, to vanish not in panic, but in rhythm, requires more than endurance. It demands foresight. It asks for a mind that can stretch beyond the present, that can hold multiple possibilities at once, that can make decisions not only in the moment, but for a future still invisible on the horizon. In the vast, sun-hammered deserts of prehistory, it was not the strongest bodies that triumphed, but the most flexible minds. Here, in the shifting heat and unpredictable seasons of arid Africa and Arabia, the human brain was forged not only in response to social complexity or predator threat, but also in response to the unforgiving logic of dryness. You had to remember where the water had been, not yesterday, but seasons ago. You had to know which clouds meant false promise, and which meant a night of sudden rain. You had to make decisions under stress that might affect not just yourself, but your family, your group, your unborn child. This kind of thinking lives in the brain's most recently evolved structure. the prefrontal cortex. It's here that humans developed what neuroscientists call executive function, a suite of capabilities that include working memory, flexible thinking, and self-control. In deserts, these weren't luxuries, they were survival tools. Imagine a group of early humans scanning the horizon at dawn, preparing for a long journey to a distant spring. They cannot see it, they cannot smell it, but they remember. They weigh the risks, they ration their water. They time their movement with the cool hours of morning. Every choice is a test of cognitive discipline. The desert, in this way, was a crucible for abstraction. You had to imagine what was not yet visible. You had to project ahead. You had to improvise routes when landmarks shifted, when riverbeds dried, when the herds changed course. Those who couldn't imagine possibilities, who couldn't hold uncertainty in the mind without panic, did not survive. Those who could passed their genes, their stories, and their skills forward. There is something deeply poetic in this, that the harshness of dry landscapes may have watered the seeds of our highest faculties, that the very emptiness of the world demanded fullness of thought. In such places, cognition was not idle reflection. It was as real and necessary as flint or fire. But foresight alone wasn't enough. These minds also had to communicate. They had to share memory of paths, of dangers, of strategies for enduring heat and thirst. And so language began to entwine with planning. Not just naming, but narrating. Not just reacting, but teaching, predicting, persuading. The mind, in essence, became like a river, able to flow beyond the present, to curve and bend around obstacles, to carry with it not just the weight of now, but the hope of later. And this river of mind began to flow not alone, but among many. A collective current, winding through bodies shaped by need, by love, by danger, and by time. This is where cognition becomes more than an internal process. It becomes shared infrastructure. A survival technology made not of stone, but of trust. In the desert, no individual mind could hold all knowledge, all memory of rainfall, migration, or hidden springs. But a group could. Minds linked through story, gesture, mimicry, song. This created a living network, a distributed intelligence spanning generations. The prefrontal cortex, that thin layer behind the forehead, is where what is becomes what could be. It allowed early humans to run simulations in their heads. If we travel at dusk, the ground is cooler. If we follow the gazelle tracks, we might reach water. If the clouds are building in the east, the seasonal rains may return. This ability, to imagine futures and weigh them, was revolutionary. But imagination requires discipline. The desert tolerates no self-deception. The prefrontal cortex also curbed impulse, delaying gratification, restraining panic, suppressing quarrels when cooperation was critical. To survive thirst, one must not drink too early. To survive heat, one must wait before moving. The same neural circuits that plan also inhibit. They whisper, "Not yet. Hold on. Think first." Even fire, the great collaborator of human evolution, depended on this restraint. You could not waste kindling. You could not overfeed the flames. You had to choose when to make smoke to signal others, and when to keep your fire hidden from rival eyes. Each of these choices required a quiet mind able to wait, to observe, to calculate. Yet perhaps the greatest test of cognition in arid lands was water. Water is not simply a resource, it is a timeline. To find it, one had to understand cycles, dry season, wet season, winds shifting from monsoon to desert breath. Fossil riverbeds, wadis, might run for only a few days a year. Lakes formed and vanished over the millennia. In this landscape, memory became a map, and unlike rivers in forests, these rivers flowed within skulls. Groups remembered not just locations, but the timing of those locations. That a waterhole near the basalt ridge only fills after 2 rains, that this acacia grove holds shade at noon because the rocks divert wind. Such knowledge cannot be carried alone, it must be spoken, rehearsed, reenacted in the footsteps of youth. Here, language begins to deepen, not only naming objects but connecting them. If you see vulture flight, follow. If the sand is crusted with salt, dig beneath. Knowledge became narrative, narratives became survival, and through narrative, cognition became more than individual. It became cultural. To live in such lands meant to understand not only the shape of the earth, but the shape of time, to predict drought. To mourn before loss fully arrived, to move not in panic, but in rhythm. And so, amidst heat and emptiness, the human mind began to flow like a river, carrying memory forward, carving possibility into barren stone. To live in such lands meant to understand not only the shape of the earth, but the shape of time, to predict drought, to mourn before loss fully arrived, to move not in panic, but in rhythm. Yet no mind, however vast, could endure the desert alone. The brilliance of our species was never merely individual intelligence, but collective cognition. In the Paleolithic desert, this truth was etched into the sand like footprints. Survival depended on shared memory, coordinated action, and emotional trust. From this pressure, a second miracle of cognition emerged, social bonding as infrastructure. In the absence of cities or shelters, it was not stone, but relationships that became the scaffolding of endurance. The same prefrontal cortex that allowed for long-range planning also enabled empathy, cooperation, and a sense of fairness. These traits were not moral luxuries, they were evolutionary imperatives. Consider the implications. If one member of a band remembered the precise location of a seasonal spring, their knowledge only had value if shared. If another knew the behaviours of migratory game, their expertise only mattered when offered in trust. To hoard knowledge was to risk extinction. To share it was to increase the odds of return for everyone. This made cooperation not a strategy, but a necessity, and with it came a subtle transformation. Groups that worked well together outlived those that fractured. Bonds formed through storytelling around fires, rituals at dawn, and whispered warnings beneath the midday sun. Memory became distributed, insight became communal, and the future became something negotiated together. But social cognition too had costs. It required self-awareness, the ability to perceive not only your own needs, but how others perceived you. It meant navigating status, conflict, and reconciliation. It meant teaching, a profound act of abstraction, in which one mind shapes the learning of another. It meant trusting that the shared path, the chosen timing, the risked detour, would lead to water. Even mobility itself was constrained by social logic. A group could only move as fast as its slowest member. Children had to be shielded from sun and thirst. Elders, though sometimes less mobile, carried the deepest knowledge. Decisions were made not for the swiftest, but for the whole. And so cognition bent around the needs of others. Abstract planning and emotional attunement intertwined. You had to forecast not just rainfall, but jealousy. Not just distance, but fatigue. To lead, you needed to listen. To follow, you needed to believe. These were not spiritual notions. They were as practical as flint, and they were transformative. For in navigating the demands of heat, scarcity, and exposure, early humans did more than endure. They shaped the very neural architecture of our species. Our minds became tuned to patterns of cooperation, to the subtle cues of discontent, to the rhythms of shared hope. The river of thought widened, deepened, and began to braid across generations, a flow of knowledge, emotion, and memory, constantly reshaped but never still. Carving its path not only through land but through each other. It is here, in this convergence of memory and mutuality, that human foresight sharpened into something more profound. Anticipation of risk. The desert, with its unpredictable extremes, became a testing ground for the mind's ability to simulate not just possible futures, but likely dangers. What if the waterhole was dry this year? What if the herd did not return? What if a dust storm swallowed the sun? Anticipation required abstraction. Unlike instinct, which reacts to the present, foresight reaches into the invisible, stitching past patterns into speculative futures. It is a kind of mental time travel. And this capacity, arguably one of the crowning features of our cognition, was forged in the furnace of environmental uncertainty. Planning became an act of vigilance. People did not simply walk from one point to another. They calculated distances in relation to thirst, to shade, to the stamina of the old and young. Rest points had to be remembered, and fallback options rehearsed. A single error in judgment, leaving too late, misjudging a wind, overlooking a cloud, could be fatal. The mind learned to be cautious, not paranoid, alert, not frantic. This balance became instinctual, and yet, foresight alone wasn't enough. It had to be communicated. A vision of danger had little value unless it shaped group behaviour. This is where cognition merged with culture, language, gesture, ritual. Warning signals embedded in tone or song, route plans sketched in sand or recited as parables. A well-told cautionary tale might save a life years later, whispered at the right moment in the mind of a child grown into a traveller. This feedback loop, experience, abstraction, transmission, built cognitive resilience. And unlike tools or shelter, this resilience was weightless. It could be carried across continents, tucked inside breath and bone. We can see its traces even now in how the mind scans for patterns, remembers warnings, imagines loss before it comes. In the desert, this was not neurosis, it was survival. But the most subtle, and perhaps most beautiful function of foresight was its moral dimension. To plan for the future is, inherently, to care about it. To ration water means to consider your future self, or the needs of others yet to arrive. To remember a shaded outcrop and return to guide others there is to value more than immediate survival. It is to invest in continuity. This is not merely cleverness. It is a kind of empathy extended forward in time. And so the human mind, sculpted by sun and scarcity, began to carry not just its own future, but the futures of others. It became a vessel not only of strategy, but of stewardship, not only of fear, but of promise. This too is a river, and it flows still. Through it, we inherit not only the capacity to endure, but the compulsion to imagine, to weigh decisions not only in the context of today's heat, but in the shade of a possible tomorrow. This is where the desert, barren to the eye, becomes fertile to the mind. For when life is sparse, every choice becomes magnified. Every action reverberates wider and longer. This is perhaps why, even in the earliest archaeological hints of these peoples, we find no monuments or structures, no grand cities or enduring stone temples. Instead, we find the artifacts of mental architecture. A shaped flint, optimized for many uses, a trail worn smooth by seasonal return, a rhythmic sequence etched into bone, perhaps a calendar of moonlight migrations. These are not just tools, they are decisions frozen in form, the material memory of abstract thought. The desert didn't strip humans of culture, it refined it. It pared away the unnecessary. Where resources were thin, complexity became internal. The body remained light, the footprint minimal. But the mind grew denser, more folded, more fluid. Every survival became a narrative, every route a shared story, every plan a collective dream. And within these dreams, something else stirred. Identity. For once, memory expands beyond one lifetime. A sense of belonging to time itself begins to emerge. You're not just a person moving across land. You are part of a continuum, of knowledge carried, of choices echoed, of warnings heeded. You begin to see yourself not as separate from the world, but as braided into its becoming. This, in time, gives rise to ethics, not in the sense of commandments or doctrines, but in something older, reciprocity. If the land gives you water, you remember. If another gives you knowledge, you pass it on. If a child is born, you teach them what the desert taught you. Walk early, rest at noon, listen to wind, trust your group, and never cross open ground without first watching the birds. The moral mind, like the planning mind, is a product of scarcity and uncertainty. It is shaped by the need to depend on others. It is born from the understanding that fragility is not a flaw, but a shared condition. In the desert, you cannot afford enemies. You cannot afford waste. You learn to see strength in gentleness and power in restraint. And perhaps this is the greatest gift of arid cognition. Not intelligence alone, but wisdom. A wisdom that knows when to move and when to wait, when to speak and when to listen, when to lead, and when to follow the path set by stars and ancestors. It is easy to forget in our world of maps and machines that our minds were forged in such silences, that long before agriculture or architecture, We were already sophisticated because we had to be. The desert demanded it, and so the mind flowed like a river through stone, leaving no ruin, but echoing still. The dust came back, not with fury, but with finality. It crept in slow, like the closing of a great eye. Where once green corridors stretched through North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, the grasses withered, the lakes shrank, and the rains faltered. This was not the first time the desert had returned, nor would it be the last, but this time humanity did not vanish with it. They moved, quietly, steadily, knowingly, carrying with them something more enduring than any tool or fire. They carried the desert within. Across thousands of years, as the Sahara and surrounding regions dried once more, around 5,000 years ago, humans who had once wandered these lands began to withdraw toward river valleys, coasts and highlands. But the desert was not forgotten. In fact, in the years that followed, it became sacred. What had once been the crucible of survival evolved into a symbol of origin. In later human cultures, from the desert monastics of early Christianity to the nomadic herders of the Sahel, the desert became more than a place. It became an idea, a space of testing, of silence, of revelation. This was no accident. For those who had lived at the desert's edge or passed through its heart, the landscape was never truly empty. It was filled with signs, with rules, with meanings that had to be read. And when the grasses died and the people left, they took with them those readings, transformed into ritual, myth, and memory. In ancient Egypt, as the Nile grew into a kingdom, the Red Land, Deshret, stood always at its margins, dangerous, yes, but also holy. The desert became the domain of the gods who moved unseen. It was where the sun god Ra passed during the night. It was the place where the soul was tested after death. The people who lived in the verdant Nile Valley still bowed to the desert's logic, its cycles of return, its silence as teacher. Farther east in the Arabian Peninsula, nomadic traditions flourished even as aridity deepened. Bedouin societies did not mourn the loss of permanence. They prized impermanence. Their poetry spoke of the stars, the scent of rain on dry earth, the lost encampments whose traces vanished in the wind. They did not build stone monuments to endure. Instead, they carried their culture in verse, in voice, in gesture. The desert, too, had taught them. What matters is what you can remember, what you can pass on, what you can carry without weight. The return of the dust was not a failure, it was a transition. A handing over of memory from place to people. And so the desert began its next role, not as a physical homeland, but as a spiritual one. A space of reflection and transformation. A place one visited not to conquer, but to understand. It had shaped the body, then the mind, and now it began to shape the soul. In this new role, the desert transcended geography. It entered language, prayer, and silence. In spiritual traditions across Afro-Eurasia, we see a persistent echo. The desert as a place of vision, purification, and encounter with the unseen. What had once been a theatre of heat and scarcity became a threshold to the sacred. In Judaism, the desert is not exile but encounter. It is where Moses meets the burning bush, where the law is given, where a people learns to become a people. 40 years of wandering, not despite the desert, but because of it. Because only the emptiness could hold something so vast. In early Christianity, the desert fathers retreated into the Egyptian sands, not in flight from society, but in search of something more enduring. To sit with heat and silence, they believed, was to strip the self bare. They walked paths once worn by prehistoric foragers, but now in pursuit of inner clarity. In their solitude, they found not absence but presence. In Islam, too, the desert is woven into revelation. The Quran speaks in metaphors of dust and oases, of winds and parched hearts. The Prophet Muhammad's early life in the Arabian deserts shaped his rhythm, his resilience. The Hijra, from one desert city to another, mirrors the ancient migratory pulses of his ancestors, and in every daily prayer Muslims face the Kaaba, whose black stone once stood sentinel in a desert that predates scripture. Across cultures, the desert becomes the place where noise dies and listening begins. It is the site of trials, yes, but not suffering for its own sake. Rather, it offers the possibility of becoming. When there is nothing to lean on, what is left must come from within. In this way, the ancient lessons of early human survival, resourcefulness, patience, observation, are translated into ethical and spiritual disciplines. Even the myths of settled civilizations hold remnants of desert origin stories. Take the Mesopotamian epics, like Gilgamesh. The hero must leave the city, cross desolate lands and seek the wisdom of the wild. His answers lie not in the temples or palaces, but in places untouched, untamed. This is a recurring pattern. Knowledge, deep knowledge, is found beyond the walls, where the sand does not forgive and thus demands truth. These ritual and symbolic returns to the desert are not nostalgic. They are necessary. They remind us that comfort can dull clarity, and that the stripped-down world has always been a crucible for insight. They are acts of remembering, not just what the desert is, but what it made us. And even today, in the arid stretches where ancient wanderers once moved between waterholes, descendants still carry fragments of that past. Not as artifacts in a museum, but as rhythms in daily life. The call to prayer echoing across dry hills, the shape of a shelter cast in shadow, the silence between words taught by the wind. This was a literacy of land that did not disappear when cities rose. Instead, it folded inward, into cultural memory, encoded in rituals and passed through generations not by permanence, but by practice. Among pastoralist societies, especially those whose lifeways persisted near desert margins, the memory of the arid world endured in how they moved, how they dressed, and how they watched the sky. The Tuareg of the Central Sahara, veiled in indigo, walk in ways reminiscent of their Paleolithic predecessors, timing their journeys with the cool hours, relying on inherited knowledge of wells invisible to outsiders. Their poems speak of longing not for lush abundance, but for the clarity of the dry horizon. In Central Asia, nomads carried similar strategies. Though the deserts were colder, the lessons were kin: mobility over settlement, memory over map. These traditions weren't born from deficiency. They were efficient, honed by millennia of experience in unforgiving terrain. A saddlebag could hold history. A single phrase could encode survival instructions for 100 miles. Meanwhile, agrarian cultures also preserved echoes of this ancestral desert logic, though transformed by the rhythms of farming. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, seasonal migration patterns remained, even among those who planted crops. Dry season festivals, planting rituals, and even burial customs retained symbolic gestures tied to movement, drought, and return. These behaviours, layered over time, weren't just adaptive, they were reverent. They treated the environment not as a stage, but as a teacher. Consider the tradition of building shade structures in desert-edge villages, not massive edifices, but clever constructions of woven branches, angled precisely to catch the prevailing wind or cast shade at just the right hour. These were not architectural indulgences. They were improvisations grounded in observation. Even the simplest of shelters spoke a dialogue with the land. This wind, this sun, this time of year. Desert wisdom also flowed into social norms. Hospitality, for instance, became not just a virtue, but a survival strategy. In arid zones where resources were few and distances long, to welcome a stranger was to recognize mutual vulnerability. The code of the guest, so deeply honored in Bedouin, Berber, and other nomadic societies, emerges from the recognition that one day you too will be the wanderer in need. And so, as the climate shifted and deserts once again expanded their reach, early humans did not simply vanish from these places, they evolved a new relationship with them. No longer purely physical terrain, deserts became cultural landscapes, mnemonic spaces that offered continuity amid change. The people left the dunes, but the dunes did not leave them. Each grain of sand, each faint trail worn by countless feet, became part of a deeper inheritance, one that taught how to move lightly, how to listen carefully, and how to remember what cannot be seen. This inheritance persisted not in great monuments, but in subtler forms, gestures, habits, oral traditions. Where stone walls erode, stories endure. And in many communities across the former desert margins, the memories of ancient survival strategies lingered in lullabies, in architecture, even in the seasonal rhythms of diet and rest. Take, for example, the persistence of timekeeping by sky, tracking the movements of stars and moons, not only to navigate space but to navigate the calendar. Among the San people of southern Africa, celestial knowledge allowed hunter-gatherers to anticipate migrations of animals, the arrival of seasonal fruits, or the shifting moods of the desert wind. This wasn't just astronomy, it was relational memory, rooted in deep time observation. And among the Bedouin and their ancestors, song and poem functioned as moving maps, each verse a waypoint, a reminder of where to find water, which path to avoid after the rains, or how to interpret the angle of a shadow at dusk. These oral traditions were not quaint folklore, they were layered with utility and reverence, shaped by a culture that knew forgetting could cost lives. This same pattern emerges in the domestication of drought-resilient crops. Sorghum, millet, dates. These were not chosen for taste alone, but for their ability to withstand the dry years. Agricultural knowledge in these regions was infused with conservatism born of uncertainty. Seed-saving practices, crop diversification, and water-sharing systems, all echoing a long-standing wariness of the return of the dust. What we see, over and over, is not the end of the desert experience, but its transformation into philosophy. Even burial practices can be read through this lens. In parts of the Sahara and Sahel, early Neolithic graves are aligned to celestial events, or clustered near now dry lakes, as if marking the memory of water. Later traditions continued this reverence, graves placed under lone trees or high ridges, symbols of shelter and orientation. The desert did not erase culture, it demanded that culture become light enough to carry. And so, we come to a striking paradox, that the harshest environments may have given rise to the most enduring wisdoms, because in a place where little could be possessed, everything had to be remembered, and what was remembered in turn became identity. As human societies moved into more temperate regions, into river valleys and coastal plains, they carried with them this imprint of the arid past. Not as nostalgia, but as a deep code, a behavioural genome shaped not in lush abundance, but in a world that asked one simple existential question: how will you endure? And now, millennia later, we still feel its presence, not in the grains beneath our feet, but in the reflexes that whisper caution, in the rituals that shape our gatherings, in the spaces between our words. These are not mere shadows of a forgotten time, they are continuities, living bridges between the Paleolithic and the present. The way we pause at thresholds, the instinct to seek shade before heat is fully felt, the reverence we hold for wide horizons and quiet places, these are the residues of desert minds. In cultures far from the dunes, echoes remain. The monastic traditions of the Christian, Buddhist and Islamic worlds, for instance, often arose or matured in arid places. The desert became a place of spiritual refinement, a proving ground where one met not just hardship, but the self. Monks and mystics sought the silence of sand not for its scarcity, but for its clarity. They were not alone in this. The Sufi poet Ibn Arabi wrote of the desert not as exile, but as presence. In emptiness, he saw fullness. Even our language bears the imprint. Words like pilgrimage, oasis, and mirage carry meanings beyond geography. They suggest states of mind, thresholds of transformation. To walk across a desert is to learn what to leave behind, and to emerge on the other side is never to be quite the same again. In this way, deserts became more than places. They became metaphors, landscapes of the soul. To survive them required not only tools but ideas. Memory became map, story became shelter, and community became the vessel for all that could not be carried alone. This is the gift the deserts gave us. As climate change looms again in our time, the return of heat and aridity brings with it a strange symmetry. What once challenged our ancestors now returns, demanding once more our attention, our humility and perhaps our memory. Because those early humans did not conquer the desert. They listened to it. They learned to bend, to move, to wait. Their genius was not in defiance, but in dialogue, with terrain, with time, with one another. And perhaps that is the final wisdom etched into the return of the dust, that survival is not domination. It is relationship, a patient, adaptive intimacy with place, a willingness to carry knowledge forward, not as burden, but as belonging. So when we see the desert today, whether through the window of a train, on the page of a textbook, or in the cracked soil beneath our feet, we are not seeing emptiness. We are seeing one of humanity's oldest teachers, and its lessons still whisper, if we are quiet enough to listen: shelter. It is the word we began with, the question that lingered like a shimmer on the edge of heat. How did they survive out there, under a burning sky, with no walls, no roofs, no door to close behind them? And now, as we reach the end of this journey, the answer arrives not in the form of stone or timber, but in something older, softer, and far more enduring. The human being was the shelter, not merely the builder of it, but the bearer of it. In memory, in motion, in firelight, and in the arms of one another, early humans carried their refuge with them, woven into flesh, behaviour, and story. To modern eyes, the early desert dweller may appear fragile. No claws, no fur, no fang. But this vulnerability was not a flaw, it was an innovation. To be hairless and soft-skinned in a place of sandstorms and searing sun seems reckless, until one sees the brilliance hidden in that bareness. Sweat-cooled bodies, nimble minds, and social bonds formed a living, moving architecture. We often think of shelter as that which keeps the world out. But what if it is also what allows the self to be fully in? Vulnerability became a form of intelligence, a way of sensing, adjusting, and remaining permeable to change. Unlike armoured creatures locked in evolutionary corners, humans bet their survival on flexibility. They did not grow thicker shells, they grew deeper relationships. This is the kind of genius that deserts demand, not defence, but attunement. The desert strips away illusion. It reduces life to its elemental truths: heat, thirst, motion, and the need for one another. It is in this stripping away that we see most clearly what shelter truly means. It is not just shade or stone. It is what happens when we stop, share, remember, and endure together. In this way, the journey through desert time is also a journey inward. As the physical shelter disappears from view, the inner one grows stronger. Memory becomes protection. Fire becomes boundary. The shared song, the passed down path, the presence of another's gaze in the dark. These become the roof beams of survival. Not visible, but real. And so, perhaps what the desert taught us is this: that to be exposed is not to be lost. That in being open to the world, we could move with it, rather than against it. To suffer heat not as a punishment, but as a rhythm. To trust that resilience could emerge not from walls, but from stories. That shelter, ultimately, was a way of being, not a thing we built. In the glow of this understanding, our ancestors stand not as shadows behind us, but as mirrors. We recognise in them something we still carry today, an instinct to gather close, to remember the way, to make meaning of hardship, and in doing so, to build a home that has no walls, and yet can hold a world. This is where our return begins, with the redefinition of what it means to be safe, to belong, to endure. In the ancient desert, it wasn't the construction of shelters that marked the triumph of human ingenuity. It was the transformation of the human being into a vessel of adaptation itself, skin that sweat, minds that planned, groups that remembered together. These were the real technologies of survival. The true miracle was not that early humans made it through the desert, but that they emerged from it carrying wisdom more valuable than any artifact. This wisdom was not buried under sand, it was written in behaviour, passed from body to body through gesture, through ritual, through imitation and improvisation. And so we see that even the most elusive qualities, intuition, emotion, empathy, were shaped by the pressures of the environment. To notice a flicker of distress on a face, to feel when the silence of a walking group turns tense, to intuit where the horizon might curve toward water. These were not abstract capacities, they were essential, and in their cultivation, a new kind of shelter was born, one made of attunement. This behavioural shelter could be carried across space, across generations, across shifting climates. It did not require raw materials. It required memory and meaning. It required being seen and seeing others. Under the blinding sun, in the absence of trees or walls, humans learned to shelter one another in the form of attention. Here, the body and mind were not split. The breath followed the wind. The steps mirrored the land. A pause in midday heat was not idleness. It was survival. A child curled under a parent's shadow was not weak. It was wisdom made visible. Even the act of walking became a sacred rhythm, legs pacing the length of memory. And yet all of this might have disappeared into dust if not for one final invention: story. The desert, after all, gave birth not only to movement, but to myth. In the barren openness of the land, meaning became the richest resource. The shapes of dunes became ancestors. The silence between oases became tests set by unseen spirits. Each hardship was translated into a lesson, and each lesson became a thread in the great woven shelter of collective identity. Later, when humans returned to greener places, when crops were planted and structures rose, these stories travelled with them. Desert gods followed them into temples. Desert rituals whispered into rain-fed valleys. And the people who had once walked the dust now knelt in fields, but still remembered the sky. This memory was not nostalgia. It was guidance. It reminded them that shelter did not begin with the brick or beam. It began with the body, the bond, the belief. And it reminded them too that even when everything is taken, shade, food, water, the one thing left, and perhaps the only thing needed, is each other. This realization casts a new light on vulnerability. What once may have seemed like fragility, our hairless skin, our slow gait, our long dependency on others in childhood, can now be seen as a radical form of strength. Because what is vulnerability, if not the invitation to connection? In the desert, being alone was a sentence, but together, even under the harshest sun, a group of humans became more than the sum of their weaknesses. They became a network, a living system, a mobile habitat. To survive, we had to turn toward one another, not out of charity, but necessity. The emotional interdependence that later blossomed into culture, art, and civilization began here, in the sand, in the sweat, in the long-shared silence of moving toward water. The first shelter was the circle around the fire, not the wall around the home. We don't often think of a gesture as architecture. But when a hand reaches out to steady a tired elder, or a parent hums a wordless tune to soothe a thirsty child, those moments become structural. They shape space, they hold time, they protect. So when we look at early humans, we must resist the temptation to measure their success by what they lacked. No buildings, no wheels, no written language. Instead, we should ask, what did they embody that allowed them not only to endure, but to seed a lineage that would someday span continents? They embodied presence, responsiveness, the courage to move with little, and to listen for signs in wind and bone. They learned to find shade not only beneath rock or tree, but within stories, within song, within the gaze of a companion who knew when to pause and when to press on. And what of solitude? The desert taught that too. To sit alone beneath a vast sky, no roof above, no comfort but one's breath and heartbeat, this was not exile. It was transformation. In the absence of distraction, a deeper perception awakened. Time stretched. Small sounds grew large. The soul, once hushed by noise and shelter, stirred. Even in modern deserts, geographical or emotional, the echo of this early solitude remains. It teaches us that silence is not emptiness, but a different kind of fullness. It reveals that what protects us is not always visible, and that what matters most is often carried, not constructed. From this vantage, the very idea of shelter dissolves into something more fluid. It becomes not a place, but a practice, an orientation, a way of being that centers not around walls, but around warmth, around holding, witnessing, remembering. And it is this that early humans gave to us, not a blueprint, but a gesture, not a house, but a horizon, not instructions, but an inheritance of how to be the shelter we seek. And so, across the ages, this wisdom spread, less as knowledge written in stone, and more as breath passed mouth to ear. Across deserts and savannas, forests and tundras, it remained, quietly shaping the human story. In every culture that came after, traces of that early lesson can be found. In the nomad's tent that folds into itself and vanishes with the wind. In the lullabies sung to children not to teach, but simply to be near. In rituals around fire that mimic the ancient circles of protection. Even as agriculture tethered some to the land and walls rose to define space, that deeper understanding never left us. The first shelters were temporary because permanence was never the point. Resilience lay in the opposite, the ability to move, to adapt, to carry shelter within, a family, a shared memory, a practice of care. The mythologies that emerge from desert landscapes echo this inheritance. The desert became more than a place, it became a teacher. Prophets in solitude, pilgrimages under sun, sacred fasts and the silence of stone. In these symbolic traditions, we see the imprint of a people shaped by the need to find meaning where there is little to see, to listen where the world is quiet. The emptiness of the desert was never barren. It was invitation. Even now, the echoes persist. In moments of great personal loss or transition, many instinctively turn to wide spaces away from noise. They retreat into deserts, literal or emotional, to strip life to its essentials, to remember what was always enough. In doing so, they mirror an old truth, that the journey inward is also a return, to something ancient, to something wise. This too is shelter. And when we look at one another with that recognition, that we are not just builders of homes, but makers of meaning, keepers of warmth, we begin to reshape what it means to endure. No longer is survival just a test of biology. It becomes an art, a way of noticing, a way of honouring the fragility that makes strength possible. In the end, it was never about escaping the desert. It was about carrying its wisdom forward, into gardens, into cities, into language and story. We walk today on streets and live beneath roofs, but still we carry the shelter of gesture, of song, of memory. Our skin remembers the sun. Our hearts remember the circle around the fire. Our minds, restless and vast, remember the sky with no ceiling. The desert, in all its severity, taught us that to be exposed is not to be undone. It is to be seen, to be refined, to be real. And from that exposure we learned the most human of skills, to turn toward one another, again and again, and in that turning become the very thing we once sought. Shelter not as place, but as presence. Shelter not as structure, but as shared breath beneath a limitless sky. And so, the arc closes where it began, not in the shadow of a wall, but in the shadowless expanse of an open world. In the beginning, humans faced the elements bare-skinned and uncertain. In the end, we understand. It was never the absence of shelter that defined us, but the presence of something deeper. A capacity to endure through care, foresight, and unity. To walk in the desert was to face all that is stark and unforgiving. Yet somehow, through that vast exposure, early humans discovered a paradox. Vulnerability was not weakness. It was a kind of knowing, a heightened sensitivity to each other, to land, to change. The very traits that allowed them to survive the shifting heat were the same ones that would later give rise to poetry, ritual, and tenderness. Even today, when technology promises insulation from the elements, many find themselves restless in its comfort. There remains a quiet yearning, a whisper under all the noise, to remember that early clarity, that shelter, real shelter, is not insulation, it's orientation, a way of belonging, of seeing, of holding one another through the passage of time. This is what the desert revealed. It stripped life down not to punish, but to teach. In its simplicity, it showed the complexity of what it means to endure, that a footprint left in sand can mean survival, that a gesture, a shared gourd of water, a shade cast by a partner's frame, can carry the same significance as any roof or wall. We return then, not only to this idea, but transformed by it. The great mythologies of modern civilization, of conquest, of dominion, of walls to keep out and fortresses to keep in, begin to soften when seen through the lens of our deeper origins. Beneath all the architecture lies a people who once endured not by separating from the world, but by listening to it, who once survived not by dominating nature, but by noticing its smallest patterns and adapting in kind. It is humbling to realise, long before cities, before even permanent settlements, there was meaning, there was kinship, there was beauty, and that beauty was enough. As this journey through the ancient desert closes, we are left with something rare in the stories of prehistory. Not only knowledge, but grace. A reminder that intelligence was never limited to tools or fire. It was the intelligence of timing, of restraint, of silence, of knowing when to walk and when to wait, when to lead and when to follow a trail invisible to the untrained eye. In the end, the desert did not just test humanity, it revealed it. And it leaves us with one final lesson. We were always the shelter. In our bodies, in our minds, in our shared presence, we carried everything we needed to endure. The rest, like the sand itself, was always shifting. But this inner architecture of empathy, of memory, of warmth, remains. Still here, still human, still enough. Thank you for walking this long arc of human firelight and memory, fellow sapiens, for wandering with us through the shifting dunes of time, where shelter was not a structure, but a story we carried within. If this story helped you feel a little more grounded, sparked a question you hadn't yet thought to ask, or offered a moment of stillness in a loud world, thank you for making space for it. Your presence here matters. Perhaps there's a single moment that lingered with you, a trace left in sand, a flicker of warmth beside a fire, a thought about who we've always been. I wonder what will echo most long after the screen goes dark. Whether it was the image of sweat shimmering on stone tools, the quiet strength of a body moving through silence, or the moment we remembered that we're each other's shade. These fragments are what bind our shared ancestry into something whole. If one of those echoes found you, I invite you to leave it below, a quiet offering, a thought for the fire circle we build together with each reflection. If this felt like something worth continuing, you can gently like, share, or subscribe. We'll keep tracing the forgotten threads, finding new paths through ancient light. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,